2024 Responsible Raw Materials Conference. We are truly delighted to welcome all of you to this year's session, which is focused in on critical choices, risk in the eye of the beholder. Now, this is session 2 because, of course, we kicked off yesterday with a fantastic lineup that included not only the wonderful Ludovine Wouters, who is here on the screen in front of you at the moment. Ludovine, give us a wave. Excellent. So Ludovine helped us to set the scene. We were then joined by the fantastic Stephen Despotito, who took us through the world of regeneration enterprises and how we can go back to some of those old mine sites and what kind of value can we get from them. Not just financial value, but different forms of value as well, which was brilliant. Doris then joined us and she took us through the world of designing sustainable prosperity. And yes, she has a book coming out soon. Hint, hint, everybody. But absolutely fantastic and looking at a patch of land in its interconnected beauty. So how do we look at all of those different natural resources together? And what does that then mean in terms of the development of the local community, etc., or society round about it? We then welcomed Terry Gard to the stage, and he took us through his work in artisanal and small scale mining across a number of commodities, but he did focus in on the world of gold. And he finished up by sharing with us some of the developments that have been made in the world of the gold capture machine, which is a relatively low cost mechanism through which you can do some of those key elements of processing with regards to gold. And it's really, really fantastic in terms of what it does for artisanal and small scale mining, because it can dramatically improve how that can be undertaken. Jodie Ann Wong then joined us and shared with us not just some thoughts on what is meant by the just energy transition, but also what is the role, or could the role, of finance be in that, and the different mechanisms through which finance can be used in a lot of these different areas. And then finally, we finished off with a fantastic Andy Reynolds, who is probably one of the most quotable people that I have ever met. There were so many awesome little sound bites and what he was talking about. And he focused in on those models that we often try and wrap around certain problems or processes, but how do we innovate beyond those models? How do we push out into that zone of chaos? And by doing that, perhaps that's how we can reimagine what the world of raw materials looks like and how we can provide all of these natural resources that we need for not just our energy transition, but actually that thriving of the 8 billion of us who live here on Earth in human form, but also everything else that lives on Earth alongside with us. So that was yesterday. Now, if you're thinking, well, hang on a second, that sounds awesome. Why didn't I dial in? Well, the reason why you maybe didn't dial in is because, well, fortunately or unfortunately, the world is, of course, round, and we have these things called time zones. And for the likes of lovely Anita, who will be speaking to us very shortly, it would have been the middle of the night. And that's not very inclusive or accessible. Oh no. So instead, what we've done for you is we recorded all of yesterday's sessions. And because the team has pulled an absolute blinder, yes, that is the technical term of the day, what they've done is they have already uploaded all of those videos onto the website, onto YouTube, so you can catch up with them immediately. Now, the way that you find out where those particular videos are is you go to this year's webpage. So this is the 2024 conference, and down at the bottom of this year's conference, you'll see here was the lineup for yesterday. So those are all of the wonderful people who we welcomed to share their ideas and their thoughts with us yesterday. And let's say, for example, I want to go and find out, well, what did Doris talk to us about? I'm going to go to the little magnifying glass here, and I'm going to type in, yeah, you guessed it, Doris. And magically, there we have Doris's webpage, and in that we have the video of her speaking yesterday, together with her abstract and her biography. And something else that we will probably add into there as well is a link to her book, because I think it will be well worth a read when it is published in August later on this year. Alternatively, if you think, well, yeah, I really like what Doris had to say, but actually I quite like to go and check out Ludovine. who will be with us all week, by the way. So here is Ludovine's lineup. So there's Ludovine's presentation that she gave to us yesterday. But as you saw in that particular drop-down list here, Ludovine, of course, has given a number of presentations throughout the last few years at Responsible Raw Materials. And so here's some of Ludovine's past work. That's not the greatest picture, though, is it, Ludovine? We might want to change that one. So we've got a number of fantastic links into Ludovine's work. So as a reminder, with regards to Responsible Raw Materials, who are we? So Responsible Raw Materials was set up back in 2020 by this motley crew that you see on the screen in front of you. So Dr. Rose Clark, Ludovine, and myself. And it was really all Rose's fault, to be honest, that this started. So Rose was doing an internship with us. This thing called COVID kind of meant that we had to change what we wanted to do. And we thought, well, hang on a second, let's set up a conference. Now, you might be wondering, where is Rose now? Well, the good news is it's not that she dislikes us and so has run away. No, instead, she has just had a baby, which is really, really exciting. And we dedicated yesterday's session to the new little person that is here on Earth with us. And I think we should dedicate today's session as well, just so we get one in the afternoon and one in the morning. So Rose, we love you dearly. We are very, very excited that you are growing the family, as it were. And this session is very much dedicated to you guys as well. We miss you, and we'll see you in a few months' time. So coming back to today's session, so I'm going to go back to the 2024 conference tab. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the page, and this is our lineup that we've got for you this morning. Just from an administrative perspective, as you can see, we are delivering all of this through a Zoom webinar. For our lovely attendees who have dialed in, you have full access to the Q&A and to the chat. So please feel free to make use of these and share your thoughts, your questions, any other resources you think that other people might find useful with regards to this general discussion in terms of what we're talking about here with regards to critical choices, different business models, different economic models, different ways of doing this thing called raw materials in the best way possible. So please feel free to engage with us. If you are watching on YouTube, you might be feeling a little bit left out at the moment because there's no Q&A button for you, but there is a chat function. So please feel free to write any questions you might have into chat. We're also monitoring all the other forms of social media, such as LinkedIn, etc. So if you do have questions, please feel free to share them with us through those channels as well. Now, because we have made things so open, what this means is that, yes, there is a little element of threat. We might be joined by a Zoom bomber. Now, that would be, on one hand, very exciting. On the other hand, it might be a little bit annoying and a bit disruptive. So we're going to leave things as open as possible. But if anybody is naughty, you have been warned, we will start to revoke your privileges. Yes, this is me putting on my school teacher voice. Okay, so if anybody's naughty, then we will start to shut down some of the ways in which we can communicate. And if you're super naughty, then what we will do is we'll go to our backup plan, which is we kill this Zoom. We send you all out a link to another one. And don't worry, with regards to YouTube, we'll sort something out and we'll send you a message in the chat and tell you what on earth is going on. So we do have a backup for that. Coming back to today's session, though, because I have 2 minutes before I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Anita. What we can see here is, and let me see if I can actually zoom in on this page a little bit. Okay, so we've got a fantastic lineup here. Each of these individuals are going to introduce themselves as we get to their session. Everyone will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we've got 10 minutes of interaction with them. I suspect that some speakers will speak for slightly longer. Some speakers will speak for slightly less time, and that is totally fine. We have a 20-minute time slot assigned to everybody, which means that everybody is a keynote speaker. Isn't that fantastic? So we're going to start off with the lovely Anita, and then we're going to flow all the way through to Hershey in a few hours' time before having a very quick wrap up at the end of this session. But that's not it for today, because in the afternoon, starting at 3 o'clock, we have session number 3, where we have another fantastic lineup for all of you. So please feel free to come in and get engaged, feed in your questions, or if, of course, these time zones are inconvenient for you, catch up overnight. We are trying to address all of the lovely comments that have come into us from LinkedIn overnight and where you've been engaging with us. This week is all about dialogue. It's all about sharing. I am absolutely sure that there will be some areas that people will disagree on, and that is fantastic because we need to get those disagreements out on the table so we can challenge one another and therefore grow as a collective group. Are there voices in our lineup that we are missing? Absolutely. Of course, there are some people that we would love to hear from who couldn't make it to this year's conference. If you are one of those people and you want to share your thoughts, then please feel free to get in touch and we'll do our best to roll you into our conversation and try and make sure that all your thoughts and ideas are heard and considered by as many different people as possible. So with regards to all of that, I am now going to welcome to the stage yet again, because Anita, this is not your first rodeo when it comes to responsible raw materials. You've been very, very kind in joining us on previous years in terms of sharing some of your fantastic ideas, not just with regards to the beauty and the wonder of the potential of tailings facilities, but actually a number of other areas within mining as well. Anita, if you want to start sharing your screen, now is a really good time to start doing that. And I'm going to, once we get all of this sorted, I'm going to let Anita introduce herself and get cracking with her presentation in this year's Responsible Raw Materials Conference 2024. Thank you very much, Anita. So, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Is that good?
Yep.
Perfect. Excellent. So, yeah, thank you very much for having me today. Before I kick off, I just want to go through the acknowledgement of country. So here at the University of Queensland, we acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship on the lands upon which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australia and indeed to the global society. So thank you very much. So the topic of today's talk is really, I guess it's connecting a little bit with what you must have heard yesterday from Stephen. And Stephen and I are working on a couple of projects together. So I'm really glad that you had the opportunity to listen to what Regeneration are undertaking. So we're going to be talking about liability to resource. So certainly, you know, within the global community, there's been a growing interest in actually looking at mine waste material as a potential resource for critical metals, but also a whole host of other minerals and indeed sort of raw materials that are necessary for the energy transition and beyond. So that's what we're going to focus on today. I am one of those speakers who is never disciplined with time. So I'm going to do my best to keep to time today. So bear with me. But before I do kick off, I also want to make some other acknowledgements, and that's to the MyWatch team. So I lead a team of researchers called Mine Waste Transformation Through Characterisation here at the University of Queensland. And you know, they are a fantastic group of people, young geoscientists and engineers who really have applied their skills to actually go out to characterise the very various waste materials that we have across the land here in Australia. So big thanks to them, and indeed to all of our state government and federal government funders for actually supporting this research. You know, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, would I, you know, be able to apply for a $20,000 grant to look at mine waste, I probably would have you know, looked a bit doubtful at that. But right now we're seeing, you know, multi-millions of dollars of research money being poured into actually looking at these materials as a potential resource. And I think that's really sort of speaking to society's appetite to really address this growing issue we have with mine waste and how we can improve its management by finding those reuse opportunities. So that's sort of a broad kind of introduction. You know, again, you're going to hear from Richard Harrington this afternoon, and, you know, he's another fantastic speaker. But really what I wanted to kick off with was looking at this. So, I mean, you know, it wasn't that long ago, 2021, that Richard published this article in Nature. I mean, firstly, you know, great to see articles like this being published in Nature, but really he articulated so well that we really do need to think about, you know, where our critical resources for the future are going to come from. And in many ways, this was a really pivotal kind of article to come out to really get the whole global community thinking more seriously about where we were going to find all of those new resources that we need for the energy transition. And, you know, certainly the Visual Capitalist put this graphic out, which really nicely kind of summarizes all of the different metals that we need to go into all of these new energy sources that we need to actually meet, you know, the green target that we've kind of set as a global community. So, you know, probably since 2021, formally through this article, but if not before, we've been thinking a lot about where our new resources are going to come from. But, you know, as time and time again, as we consider kind of the push towards more mining, it's inevitable that we're going to be generating more waste. And, we've got to thank UN Secretary General once again for throwing mining under the bus a little bit just a couple of days ago, when, obviously in announcing the new critical energy transition minerals panel on the 26th of April, he made this statement where he's obviously concerned about the energy transition. Who isn't? But obviously for developing countries, there's obviously a lot of potential there for I guess negative issues sort of in a social context, but certainly thinking about environmental issues, there's a very big opportunity here for us to make the same mistakes that we've made in the past. I mean, using language like toxic cloud in its way, can articulating that there could be pollution, really sets in mind that, if we're going to continue to mine, we have to be more responsible in terms of how we're going to manage these mine waste materials up front. So, we've got a twofold problem here. We've got existing mine waste materials, but we've also got to think about what we do with those future mine waste materials as well. Because, if we pivot back to something that Daniel Franks published in 2021, he was kind of articulating how many billions of tons might be produced, over the coming 5-year period. So I guess he was thinking about 21 to 26, and he's estimated that there'd be about 13 billion tons of additional tailings. And, for global context, if you find it hard to imagine what 13 billion tons would look like, then once again, the visual capitalist put together this graphic. And here you can kind of get the sense of, if you compare that to kind of the island of New York and Manhattan there, you can kind of see that this is a mountain range worth of material that we're going to produce. And this isn't just, static material. This is material that contains sulfides. It could present risks in terms of dust. So many environmental pollution risks are posed by these types of materials. So, in terms of kind of pivoting back to what the Secretary General said, just at the weekend, there's something in it, and we do definitely need to be doing something different as we move towards the future. And this isn't new news to anybody on this call, and it's not something new that I'm saying here at all, but it is still something very much that's on our mind. It's not something that we've got ahead of, in many ways, particularly well. I mean, if we looked at the Ernst Young kind of risks in mining from 10 years ago, I'm going to imagine that things like tailings and mine waste and net zero and climate change probably featured in those top 10s. I mean, I'd give you the challenge of going back to have a look, and I'm going to say that ESG and things like that definitely sat in the within the top 5 positions there. But tailings and waste management are still very much on the mind of our mining companies when they think about the risks in mining. That very much includes how we manage these waste rock facilities and indeed these tailings storage facilities, because we haven't really got too far away from thinking about Brumadinho, Samarco and all those tailings disasters. I mean, it was only a couple of months ago, I think, in Asia where we had another heap leach failure. So we're still seeing these tailings storage facilities fail, and the impacts to the communities are long lasting, and indeed, the financial detriments to the companies involved too. So we definitely need to do something different. And, great for in terms of, thinking about the stability of these tailings storage facilities, because, global community got together, they put out the global industry standard on tailings management. That came out, I guess it was 2021, 2022. And indeed, there was 15 principal areas and 77 auditable requirements that, were fed back to industry to kind of govern their tailings storage facilities in terms of the physical structure. And we've certainly seen a lot of companies now sort of go back, reevaluate their tailings dams to avoid any future Brumadinhos and Samarco type disasters from happening in the future. Has this been successful? I'm not going to debate that here, but certainly, there were some articles and reports that came out after, the publication of the global standards, sort of suggesting that maybe more could be done. And that's probably a whole day's worth of debate and topic that's probably for another time. But I guess the point is, after that big kind of physical stability events that happened concerning tailings storage facilities, we saw global action happen. And I think that's a really good thing, that actually people did get together and we had this new standard come out. But I would say that when it comes to things like acid and metalliferous drainage, I haven't seen something equivalent published to that standard as global community. And it really troubles me and also puzzles me why something like acid and metalliferous drainage isn't met as, with the same gusto that it needs to be. Because once upon a time, the United Nations did say that after climate change, acid and metalliferous drainage, elution into the environment from mine waste materials, was actually the second biggest global challenge that we face environmentally. So if that's the case, why have so few people heard about it? And why does it feel like, in terms of progress to actually combat AMD, that so little is being done as a global community, or so little effective work is being done? I mean, what you're looking at here is an example from Western Tasmania, and it's probably one of Australia's most famous examples when it comes to AMD elution into a riverine environment. So here we have, decades upon decades of mining, and predominantly this was for copper. And, you know, associated with these copper minerals were things that form acid. So we had a lot of pyrite, a lot of iron sulfides contained in that material, and it oxidized and it eluted into the environment. And it's still eluting into the environment as we speak, coming from those underground adits straight into the Queen River, into the King River, and for the whole distance to, I guess, the King River Delta and into the estuary there. You know, it's aquatically dead. And in terms of a solution to, you know, cure this, the Tasmanian government hasn't got one on the table yet. So we need to see less of these happening in the future. And if we're going to mine more, we're only going to see more and more incidences of things like Mount Lyell occur from time to time. And I don't necessarily want more case studies to talk about. No. You know, recognizing that, you know, the best way to, you know, deal with this problem is to think of it as a source pathway receptor chain. Obviously, that's the pollutant linkage chain. And, you know, when we look at examples like this, like Mount Lyell, what we're seeing here is, you know, most approaches to try and manage this have been reactive. We've got a problem, we need to find a solution. We need to treat it, we need to mediate it, we need to sort of, you know, add neutralizer or something, or try and precipitate out the copper. The very reactive solutions, but we're not thinking about the source pathway receptor chain from the source. But actually, if we looked at the source, you know, and broke that chain there, then we actually have an opportunity to maybe generate some critical metals or find some resources for the energy transition, which doesn't necessarily mean that we have to develop as many new mine sites as we might have thought, you know, when we think about meeting the future energy transition challenge. So, you know, certainly this isn't a new school of thought. You know, thinking about mine waste as a potential resource is something that we've all been saying for many years. And I had the opportunity to contribute to the conversation in 2016, where, you know, we actually explored some of the opportunities for looking at mine waste material as a resource, not necessarily for critical metals. I think at this point, this was before critical metals kind of felt like it went viral. But certainly, we've always recognised that the best way to actually de-risk, you know, existing mine waste material is to break that source pathway receptor chain by looking at the source as a potential value. But yeah, certainly the critical mineral strategy here in Australia has been a game changer for how we look at mine waste material, because, you know, people like myself and people like Stephen and other people on the call who work very much in the mine waste space, if we've been going out characterising these sites, looking at environmental pollution and environmental legacies, things like arsenic, things like, you know, bismuth, nickel, you know, all these things, selenium in particular, we've recognised them as being potential contaminants. But now, because of the critical mineral strategy, the value of these has completely changed. Now, actually, we want to see hotspots of these materials because they could represent future resources of materials. So in terms of breaking that source pathway receptor chain at the source, it actually adds some, you know, serious weight behind that argument from a financial term, because we actually want these resources. And, you know, certainly the circular economy has also been a bit of a game changer for how we look at mine waste in this country as well. So you're looking at a map here. I've shown this 1,000 times, and unfortunately, I'm probably going to keep showing it forever. But, you know, it's a really good way to capture all of the many, many different sites we have across Australia where there's been reportings of mine workings captured in state government, you know, databases and so forth. So we can see that across Australia, there's been a lot of activity, which means there's a lot of kind of residual piles. We're talking from very, you know, significant kilometre scale tailing storage facilities to just, you know, small mullock dumps, but they're out there, and some of them potentially might be oxidising, producing AMD. So, you know, when we think about the diversity of these sites, you know, it's the best job in the world that I have, because look at the variation of all of these different field sites. You know, we need to develop very different, you know, sampling methodologies. We need to think about, you know, all the different sort of factors, and there's lots and lots of different materials to go out and sample. You know, it's, you know, no two sites are the same. And so for, you know, if you like mineral exploration and you want to contribute to, you know, I guess the energy transition, then certainly getting into these environments will not leave you bored, because we have over 50,000 to get into, and we've only just started scratching the surface. And so funded by lots of different state governments, and indeed with some opportunities to work a bit more collaboratively and directly with mining companies, we've actually been able to go out and sample a lot of these sites in Australia. So we've got sort of 3 programs of work that we call Stream 1, Stream 2 and Stream 3. Now, a Stream 1 program is where we go out to a site, we sample that site in a very sort of short targeted campaign. We collect, you know, up to 80, 100 samples from that particular site, and it can be any type of waste. It can be tailings material, it can be waste rock, it can be spent heap leach, it can be slag, anything you like, anything that's possibly present at that site. So we'll take about, you know, 80 to 100 samples. We'll put that through a very methodical and detailed assay program. So we can look at the chemistry of these materials. And once we've got that chemical data, we'll then do a very targeted mineralogical study, because if we don't understand the mineralogy of these samples, and not just the bulk mineralogy, but the in situ mineralogy, like how are those minerals actually cited within that material? You know, what grain size are they? What are they associated with? All of those factors we actually need to understand if we're going to think about mineral processing and actually recovering metals from that material. So we do a targeted mineralogy program. And once we've completed that, we then look at the mineral chemistry of particular minerals. So if we, for example, if we were chasing cobalt in pyrite, then, you know, after we've done our bulk mineralogy and our in situ mineralogy to understand, you know, the particle size of the pyrite and what it's kind of associated with. Is it touching other sulfides? Is it touching, you know, silicates, for example? Is that, you know, we need that information to think about how the mineral separation is gonna be. But we actually need to understand how that cobalt is sitting within the pyrite, and that's why we need the laser ablation study as well. So once we've collected all of that information, that's called a stream 1 study, you know, then we've got enough information there to make recommendations about if the site's fertile for that particular critical metal. And then we also get to think about, you know, what processing methodologies might be useful for that particular site. So you can see, you know, we've had a lot of sites across Australia that we've been working on. Some sites, the data has already been released, particularly in Queensland and Northern Territory. We're about to release 20 reports from New South Wales next month. But, you know, we've started to work on sites in Western Australia, and in a previous life, we did a lot of work in Tasmania as well. So a lot of information we're now generating on some of the major waste facilities in Australia. Now, I haven't got time to walk through all of the 48 elements that we assay for. So I'm just going to choose one because I think it connects also with the next talk because it's focused on cobalt. So some of the early results that we've got, I'm going to share with you here. I can't share with you the New South Wales results because they're embargoed until next month, I'm afraid. But certainly there's some very juicy things going on there. So you're going to have to download those reports and tap into that. But certainly what you can see is, you know, relative to 10 times crustal abundance, we certainly have some hot spots of cobalt situated in, I guess, the Tennant Creek area here in the Northern Territory, and certainly in the Northwest Minerals Province in Queensland, where we've actually been able to do a lot more work in terms of metallurgical recovery. So what we're looking at here is a bit more of a zoom in terms of Queensland. And indeed, you know, we've got that screening of, you know, anything above 10 times crustal abundance we're considering to be quite elevated. So there were some sites that really stood out to us: the Osborne tailings, the Great Australia waste rock, the Kuradala, I think that was a mixture of waste rock and slag materials. And certainly at Rocklands, we've had a big tailings project there as well. So we definitely have the potential here for some future resources of cobalt, which, as we all know, we need for the energy transition. And I guess what we've done with that is we've done some further test work with various collaborators and so forth. So at Rocklands, for example, we've looked at, you know, how we can actually develop a new methodology to recover more efficiently or concentrate more efficiently the pyrite from this particular tailings storage facility using a new carrier flotation method, which JOGMEC have patented. Over at Osborne, we've worked with Cobalt Blue using their proprietary technology to actually do some test work to see if we can actually improve the concentration and the elution of cobalt from those tailings, which we have been able to do in comparison to conventional methods. And at this site, Pindora, we're looking at cobalt hosted in iron oxide. So here we've been using a new leaching technology developed by Innoveco to, again, more efficiently recover cobalt and copper from this spent heap leach material. So lots of exciting things to do, and certainly in collaboration with a lot of new startups. And it's an area of interest for students too. So this is one of my students here, Lauren Nichols. She's soon to finish her PhD, but certainly working at Capricorn Copper. You know, she's done a very detailed cobalt deportment study to really understand where the cobalt is. If you don't do these detailed deportment studies and understand the mineralogy, you're not going to make a buck from the site, in my opinion. So she's certainly gone through that process, and she's undertaken, you know, flotation test work as part of that, and is soon to wrap up. So it's good stuff to see younger people sort of coming into this space and applying their geo skills to actually get this work done. But, you know, the whole thing was liability to resource. That was kind of the title of my talk. And it is actually getting traction with the federal government and indeed the state government. So, you know, federal government now bestowing grants like 2.2 million to Evolution Mining to retrieve cobalt from mine waste. And I don't want to give myself a pat on the back there, but I certainly think the work that MineWatch have done has actually influenced some of these grants that we're seeing. And certainly through the Queensland state government, they're now offering $5 million to drive critical mineral discoveries in mine waste. And again, don't want to give the team too many pats on the back, but certainly our work, you know, with the Queensland State Government, I think has led to them actually seeing the value in putting out grants for explorers and startup companies like Regeneration to come to our state and actually, you know, tap into these projects, you know, get more samples, do more bankable tests, met test work, and actually, you know, generate those resource models and think about what mining can look like. So really great to see those grants actually being spent to actually drive mineral exploration and mine waste for critical metals. So ultimately, our data is going to feed into this thing here called the Atlas of Australian Mine Waste. So it's currently out right now, version 1, and that was done with Geoscience Australia and also in collaboration with RMIT University. So we've mapped out, and if you know Gavin Mudd, he was instrumental in this. We've mapped out where kind of a lot of the TANG sites are across the country. But now my team, My Watch, we're actually putting that data into these kind of, I guess, sites or cells, whatever you want to call them. And what we're really generating is pre-competitive data for investors seeking critical metal waste sites in our country. This is kind of catching on. I mean, I see other states, not other states, well, certainly in terms of the grants, definitely other states. I think the Northern Territory and New South Wales are thinking about releasing those kind of exploration grants for mine waste in a similar context. But globally, we're seeing the Americans, the Canadians, the Europeans, everyone, and even the South Africans, everyone's becoming very cognizant of developing something much like the Atlas of Australian Mine Waste. And I think that's what we need to see. So I guess, you know, as a quick summary, you know, that's kind of where we probably see the value sitting from the work that we've done. And really, you know, characterizing mine waste, it's not a waste of time. The amount of times I've been in meetings, people are like, nah, it's a bit of a waste of time. It's absolutely not. If you do not characterize your mine waste, and if you do not understand the mineralogy, you will not make a buck. And characterizing that mine waste upfront in any sort of project, it's not a cost. It should be seen as a strategic investment, because you can, you know, understanding the mine waste could be something that you could then, you know, potentially remine in the future. Now, there are a lot of things that I could say, and I'm not going to, because I've definitely run out of time. But certainly one thing to just finish on is, you know, when we think about new deposits and new resources, we have to actually do that environmental characterization right up front. I mean, that's the key. I mean, I guess going back to the UN Secretary General's statement, you know, we want to avoid that environmental pollution. And the way that we can really do it for future mine sites is actually to characterize it and use the new technology that's available to actually, you know, better do that environmental forecasting and domaining. So, you know, article that we wrote in Elements magazine came out in December. Definitely recommend you tap into that if you're interested in that type of approach to environmental de-risking up front. And indeed, having lots of conversations. So we had the first Australian Mine Waste Symposium in February, and it was really well attended. We had about 160 people attend. We had academics, we had politicians, we had, you know, people working in government, we had startup companies, you know, Regeneration with that. We had so many people in the room wanting to talk about how we can actually, you know, look at liability to resource of mine waste material. So this is a conversation that's only going to get bigger. So many things I could say, but I'm going to have to stop there. Thank you very much for having me today. And if you've got any questions, please get in touch with me. I think it's going to be time for us to get back out into the field now. We've got a few more sites to wrap up, so I'm actually going to be heading off at the office in a couple of days to get cracking again. So thank you very much for having me today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Anita. Everybody, round of applause for the fabulous Anita. Thank you very, very much. Absolutely brilliant. So Anita, unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions, but you do have some coming in the chat, including one from me. So I would love it if you could try and respond to that, which would be fantastic. But everyone, please give Anita another round of applause. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Absolutely fantastic. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to our next speaker. And so our next speaker is the fabulous Guilherme, who will be sharing his slides very, very shortly. So we're going to go from that wonderful world of the potential of tailings and other forms of waste in Australia to, as you can see here in the slides that are beginning to be shared, securing the EU cobalt supply chain and having a positive impact. So what kind of considerations might we need to take a look at if we're considering the potential of the artisanal mining sector? So with that, everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Guilherme. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks Sarah for the introduction, and thanks everyone who's participating, and for those who woke up very early to listen to us. I hope that my title says it all. It's really about securing the EU cobalt supply chain and having a positive impact. It's quite a summary of the current dilemma is that we hear that we listen into the new EU regulations. It's really about the EU wants to show itself as the forefront of ESGs, being very strict regulations, making sure that we have a positive impact, but at the same time, that they want to be still a competitor in terms of industry and being to have in their own hands and to control their own energy transitions. And for that, they need a cobalt. So that's what my presentation is going to be about. But first, I'd like to, in 2 words, introduce EPIS. We are an NGO, but we see ourselves more as an independent research institute. We're based in Antwerp, in Belgium, and we've been working on business and human rights and conflict analysis in the Great Lakes regions for, well, EPIS for 40 years, but myself for 8 years. And so now to come back on the cobalt in the DRC, it's going to be a very short snapshot to leave rooms after for the other things. But yeah, the cobalt earth and mining sector in DRC, it represents around 10% of the worldwide productions of cobalt. How we arrived to this number, we usually say that 70% of the Congolese cobalt production represents the worldwide production, and of this, 15% comes from the ASM production. That represents, according to the latest estimations that we have, it's between 150 and 200,000 workers working in the ASM cobalt production, and that's the livelihood of between 800,000 and 1 million people in DRC. So what are the challenges of those? And in that snapshot, I want to speak about the challenge of this sector. And the first challenge is, of course, this is a very informal sector. So all the numbers I just gave are estimations because the miners are not registered, the production is not registered, the production is not traced, which means also that the purchases are not registered. So there is no tax, there is no money that the government can make on those production. Of course, there's been a lot of work to formalize the sector, and most of the initiatives and regulations and the new mining code in Congo are trying to formalize the sector, but so far the successes have been limited. And one of the things where it's limited, it's on the ZEA. The ZEA are zones specifically dedicated to artisanal miners. Unfortunately, they're not enough, and when they exist, they're usually not very productive. So there's very few miners going there, which means that in fact the artisanal miners worked on the concessions that are owned by large-scale miners, and that creates tense and sometimes violent cohabitations. When we talk about violence, we can mention in 2019 when the Congolese army chased away thousands of miners from the TFM mines. Same happened in Fungurume also in 2019. In Kisangala also, artisanal miners were chased away with weapons by large-scale miners. You can also have situations where it's a stalemate, where the large-scale miners knows that if they make a move, that will create a social unrest. We can, for example, mention the Shabara mine. Of course, it's not one-sided. You also have large-scale miners who complain about having artisanal miners on their mining sites, but they can't really chase away them, or they are victims of like sabotage, or material is destroyed, or simply they don't dare to go where the artisanal miners are because they want to avoid violence. But so because they don't have this specific place where they can work, that's also increased difficult working conditions. So basically the artisanal mining sector, it really means for it's miners going into under pits that can be, the law requires that it doesn't go under 30 meters deep, but of course it goes much deeper to that. And because it's informal, they don't take the time to secure their tunnels, and it becomes very dangerous. And then we can all speak about pit collapse, but it's also more smaller injuries, but like back pains are very occur very often. Breathing dust also occur very often. So, as I was saying, in the last 20 years, we've been voting regulations, we've tried certifications, we've tried traceability systems. I'm going to speak about initiatives, but that englobes regulation, certification systems, traceability system. And so I'm saying the last 20 years because the very first time we really tried to formalize the artisanal mining was in the DRC mining code in 2002. And since then, we've had a lot of different initiatives, regulations, certifications. What's interesting to see is that between 2000 and 2015, we really talk about the 3T. It's more about the 3T. And it's really about a link that we make between the conflicts and the minerals. So that's the period when we speak about the conflict minerals, the blood diamonds, the blood minerals, and all the first initiatives. And the US Dodd-Frank, for example, translate that very narrative is we want to stop the funding of conflicts through the minerals. And then, so we have this narrative for around until 2012, 2013. And then by 2017, let's say, 2016, we start to have more a view on the cobalt because we start to speak more about the energy transitions. The Western world starts to notice that they actually need to control their supply chain that has been delocalized before. And then we talk about the cobalt. And the first things we talk about is about child labor and how we can mitigate those things. And so you have private initiatives that I mentioned here in 2018. You have the Motoshi project. You have Cobalt for Development. In 2020, you have Fair Cobalt Alliance are coming in. EU is always a bit late. So in 2017, the first rules of the EU is the conflict mineral regulations that was voted in 2017 into force in 2021. But then what you have is really, first, it's really about the conflict, and then it's about energy transitions. And at the same time, the first laws that are about, I'm sorry, that's why you don't see it up. The first EU regulations now arriving in 2020, the first discussions are about how can we have strategies to secure our supply chain. And those new rules, and especially, for example, the EU battery regulation, it's really about how can we secure our supply chain and having a positive impact on the ground, or at least to mine responsibly. And so what were the results of those initiatives? When I speak about initiatives, I'm including the regulations, the traceability systems, and the private initiatives. But the first thing is, and it's very positive, it's that it shed lights on the conflict in Eastern Congo and the working conditions of the ASM in DRC. The second results that we have worked into and that we have researched is that there is no really incidence on the working conditions, unfortunately, and the salary of the miners has not increased. In fact, what we noticed when we deep dive into those research is that the miners don't have an incentive to be part of those initiatives. So they tend to stay independent and to work under their own conditions. And the third result of this is that this increased attention on ASM has really been about child labor, working conditions, and that has shadowed the misdeeds and the negative impact of the LSM cobalt sector. That can be destruction of the environment, the destruction of the fields, forced displacement, depletion and pollution of water. And what we can see is actually that those initiatives and regulations, mostly they try to solve issues that matters to the consumer and or in general, or to a general audience, but it doesn't speak to the local communities. When you go in the field, like the local communities, it's not that they don't really care about child labor, but they don't think it's one of the major problems. Their issues is really about the destruction of their field, the destruction of their crops, the health that are getting deteriorated due to pollution of water that brings skin issues and the forced displacement. And so another things that we could think is that those initiatives, first, the results were limited, but why this impact of these initiatives has been limited is specifically because a bit of what I've just said, we focus on the symptoms, just like child labor, but not on the disease. And one of the disease, for example, could be the access to land. If you manage to have a better access to land for artisanal miners, you can actually solve the issues of what I was saying before, the violence between ASM and LSM. And you can actually improve the working conditions because they will have time to secure their pits. One of the other limits, or why the impact has been limited, it's because those new EU regulations, they're simply not known. There's no concrete measures taken on the ground. I'm taking, for example, the example of the battery regulations that foresees a grievance mechanism for injured parties when your field has been destroyed, for example. But on the ground, nothing has happened. No one is aware of those things. And even, in fact, the EU Commission has not really worked on implementing concretely a grievance mechanism. So those laws are voted here, but they don't have a really an effect in the regions where the cobalt is extracted. As it's a bit similar to the results I was talking about, but the demonization of the ASM to the benefit of LSM is again shadowing the bad effects of the LSM. And so, but it has taken like a marketing views that, for example, you will hear companies saying like, oh, we will not buy from ASM horizontal mining because you have child labor, because of the poor working conditions. But we've never heard any company saying we will not buy from companies that have been convicted of corruptions, or we will not buy from companies that have been convicted of polluting the waters of local communities. And so, again, it's the impact has been quite limited also because we always have this humanitarian approach towards ASM, just to solve and to put bandages on wounds, but not to work with ASM as a business partnership. And that's a bit what I was trying to think about. This is how can we improve this and to work with ASM as a real source of cobalt. So the idea is like, how would it be possible to actually invest in the ASM supply chain? And so I did like a quick SWOT analysis, and I'll be happy to speak about this with you afterwards. But it's really about securing a new supply chain of cobalt, which is exactly what I'm saying the EU, but that's precisely what every countries or powers wants to do today. But if you secure your own supply chain in the ASM, you can actually impose your own standards. And because EU wants to be the forefront of ESG standards, we can come up with our standards and integrated the inclusion of women, for example, or things like this. The strength also is that we have strong local partners. The government, the GECAMIN, are really willing to work with horizontal miners. And what I've written on the slide is a bit misleading. There's a high acceptance by local communities. At least there's a higher acceptance by local communities of ASM in comparison with the LSM sector. And so from those trends, you also have these opportunities. I was saying, if you give a clear spot and you formalize the sector, you can actually improve the relations between the ASM and LSM. And then you can have a positive impact on the livelihood of those local communities. About the strong local partners, that's also an opportunity because you can work with existing initiatives that are still working now. You have the Fair Cobalt Alliance, you have EGC, the Entreprise Générale du Congo, that has right now a monopoly, but it's not very clear if it's a monopoly or not. But they're working with the horizontal miners and they're trying to refine the production of the horizontal miners and to sell it in a formal way. And finally, you also have, as I was saying, those local strong partners. They really want to work the ASM. And lately, it was in February 2024, the GECAMIN has just given 5 concessions for ASMs, 5 ZEA, specifically dedicated to horizontal miners. Of course, I know it has weakness and threats, and it can be like it's a risky and it's a costly project. But you all work in the sector, so you all know that any project in the mining sector can be costly and risky. You can also find difficulties to find partners. It's not sure that LSM will give space for horizontal miners on their own concessions. And of course, there is a weak local governance. So I was saying before, yes, you have local strong partners that officially wants to work with you. But you will always have, the Congo is a complicated country in terms of governance, and you can also have people who will be against your project and you're not very aware of. And of course, the threats, we're talking about mining. There is financial risk, obviously, but you can also have reputational damages for the EU, if the project doesn't work and you end up with children on your minds, it can be really damaging in terms of reputations, or you can be associated with bad partners. Unfortunately, many of the private sector that are working now in Congo have been convicted of corruptions or have been convicted or sued for child labor or things like this. So finding partners with a good reputations can also be difficult, but also his bad reputations can taint on the EU or the investor. And yeah, that was, I don't know how long I took to speak, but that was a bit the presentation I wanted to make, and I'll be happy to speak with you about what my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. Fantastic. Round of applause, everybody. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I think we've got time for maybe one question, Guillaume, and that one has come in privately to me in the chat, and it asks about investment in ASM and normal stewardship rules with regards to that, and the complexity, I guess, with regards to money coming from elsewhere into the world of artisanal and small-scale mining. Do you have any comments with regards to that, or is it a case where we need to rethink stewardship or some of those rules that sit within all of that?
So what do you mean exactly by stewardship?
So I know that Ludovine will have thoughts on this as well. Maybe if the person who's asked the question wants to expand on it. But Ludovine, I know that this is something that's close to your heart. Do you want to expand?
Yeah, I think the difficulty is that most companies or investors who could invest in ASM probably have rules. I think that's what stewardship refers to prohibit them from even trying to invest in ASM. And you were talking about this reputational risk. So the difficulty is that we need to find a way to let companies try to do this without penalizing their efforts if they go wrong. But at the same time, we need to make sure that they make all the best efforts so that they do source the right partners. So I presume the question was about how do we enable that kind of financing?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of those, this is when you see that it's really human limits that we put to ourselves, because on this, but the best way, I think, it's to find, and actually there was a Mutoshi project. It was funded by Trafigura and Chemaf that have worked with the ASM. And maybe one way would be that the money would go through actually the private sector and the LSM willing to work with. EGC is also a company that the Congolese state has put in place, and that the idea that they have is that it would channel all the artisanal production, and then they would sell it, and they would be formalized, and so they pay the taxes. So you could also work with EGC, but as I was saying, there is a weak governance in DRC, and that includes also for the EGC. So it's a huge problem, and I agree with this. But that's also, maybe you could also make, you could actually promote also the work that you do around the ASM and saying we're investing massive money. And the second and third, it might sound a bit like contradictory to what I was saying, by the fact that saying like we have to stop with this humanitarian view, but you can also work with the GIZ, you can work with Enabel, the Belgian corporations. Those can also channel money and having projects to work with actually artisanal miners, and then you can have those public-private sectors partnerships and investments.
Thanks.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
you very
Guillaume.
much. Yeah, I know that there are more questions that are coming in for you in the chat, but with that, we're going to move on to our next fantastic speaker. So I'm going to remove my spotlight off myself because we don't need that one anymore. I'm going to welcome to the stage the fantastic Jeff Deans. Now, Jeff, if you want to start sharing your slides now is a good moment to start doing this. Jeff, we're going to go back to Australia again. So we had Anita to start with today. who was speaking to us from Brisbane. Obviously, we've just been hearing about the DRC, so we've been hearing about Africa, maybe bringing in some of those learnings from that European perspective, etc. as well. And now we're going to head back to Australia again. So, Jeff, whenever you're ready to share those slides, we shall hand back to you again, unless you want to introduce yourself without slides first and then start sharing.
So I'm having the IT issues. They should be up on the screen.
Not yet,
right
but it's
now.
okay. We can go to plan B. Aileen, did you get the slides across from Jeff?
No, I haven't emailed
Okay.
them because it worked before. So
Okay, that's fine. Well, Jeff, do you want to keep trying to share your slides? And I will keep padding at the moment because everyone loves a bit of Sarah padding.
There we
Fantastic.
go. What about now?
We can see your monitor. And now we can see the other version of the slides at the moment. It's okay. It's okay. So if you can flip around so we see the other viewpoints up at the top of your screen, and it's probably going to be underneath the Zoom controls, there'll be a settings drop-down list that you can play with. Aileen, maybe if you can help Jeff behind the scenes, that would be great.
Yeah.
Everybody, you can see that, yeah, Jeff is going to be talking about mountains and molehills and modifying factors. So why have we invited Jeff along to speak to us today? Because we've been speaking about the potential of tailings facilities. We've been speaking about what about considering the artisanal and small scale mining aspects of all of this. And now we're going to go diving into that world of geology. And this is actually very close to the hearts of all of us here in Responsible Raw Materials, because the first name of Responsible Raw Materials was actually Responsible Reserves, and talking about, well, hang on a second, if we get sustainability in a meaningful fashion into those calculations and the modeling of what do we think might be in the ground, and can we get it out of the ground, or should we get it out of the ground? Those were some of the first questions that we asked ourselves, and we'll put into the chat for all of you to be aware of in a second, the links to some of the roundtables that we held back in 2020 and then in 2021, where we pulled together many of the different organizations who are experts in this area. And I'm truly delighted to welcome to the stage today the fantastic Jeff to give us his take on all things mountains and molehills, modifying factors and risk orientation. So Jeff, take it away.
Excellent. And thank you so much for bearing with me with those IT issues. So straight into it, go to the next slide. So, and as touched upon around the modifying factors, it's not a new term. It's been around a long time to talk about ore reserve statements and disclosures, but as the world's evolved and ESG considerations have come in, these preconditions and considerations have really come to the fore. And really it comes down to perspective. You know, the JORC code or the codes that are around disclosure provide a lot of insight into what needs to be considered. But the materiality and the perspective around those considerations is really changing at pace. And that really underpins, you know, again, how much of the resource can you access and under what conditions. So, and really the difference between a mountain and a molehill comes down to perspective. Stakeholders value different common factors for different reasons, and the impacts to those common factors have a different level of materiality. And, you know, you see this all the time in terms of resource development, water, land, environmental impacts in different jurisdictions and different contexts. Certain activities will be acceptable and in other areas they won't be. And that contextualized considerations are really important for being able to understand what a resource needs to be. Again, if people aren't aware, the term modifying factors has been around for a long time. It's represented in over 81% of global disclosure standards. So for the geologists that are here, you'd be close to heart, you'd understand what it is. But certainly with a lot of the reviews going on, especially with the JORC code in Australia, there's a lot of consideration around what needs to be true to be able to make those reserve statements to give investors confidence, but all stakeholders at the same time, because people, again, care about common factors for different reasons. So if we're thinking about uncertainty, there's need to think about risk. So there's really 4 phases to this, and when disclosing information or making assessments and doing analysis, there's really 4 stages to think about. So you know what you know, you know what you don't know, so you need to be able to do more work there. You don't know what you don't know, so that'll be a problem. But the big one is, and this comes in all the time for managing modifying factors, is what people know for sure that actually isn't true. So information's put into models, there's assessments, there's understanding that things will be acceptable, that they'll be legal, they'll be moral, they'll be ethical, they'll be allowed. And then when it comes to realizing those investment decisions, conflict arises or there's constraints in those resources. And that's really where assessment and analysis can really interact with each other and cause some problems for projects. So again, same but different. How do you think about this systematically, especially when you're talking about resource development that can take multiple decades from first discovery to first production? And then in the current context, we're looking to expedite development. So how do you systematically unpack and unpick what needs to be true for projects to be realized? So using understanding that, and you need to do this anyway for disclosure around the common factors, which are the modifying factors, how are they then considered in their host context, or with the legacy issues, or with the perspectives of the stakeholders that are essential or material to be able to make decisions. So your investors, your insurers, your host communities, your regulators, they may have different perspectives on risk and acceptance of activities than you do. And especially, and we've seen with global impacts and disasters that have happened, that it's reset the benchmarks and the baselines of what is acceptable and what a risk appetite may constitute. So that's a challenge for project proponents as we're trying to move fast and get projects up. But the reality is that you can sometimes only go as fast as the slowest party. And again, the performance expectations are changing globally. We're hearing this in all the great speakers tonight. You know, complexity is increasing, risk appetites are going down, and stakeholder expectations are going up. That makes for a pretty challenging context to be able to build projects and realise the value of the resources that are in the ground in a way that people are willing to accept and endorse. Again, the way that we view performance is changing. What was once an or conversation, so the technical, financial, production requirements, is now an and conversation. You know, there's an expectation that project proponents, from whether it's the local level stakeholders, the investors, and everyone, will do everything concurrently at the same time for probably lower cost and less impact. Now, that changes the recipe. Really, the ingredients are quite static. You know, the ingredients haven't changed. It's really the recipe on how projects are done and developments are made, because we understand the modifying factors. It's then how do you sequence and develop that to understand the risk profile and the value profile. And the question is, you know, that's a bit academic, but what does it look like in real life? And I'm not sure many of you will have seen this slide before, or this information. It's been around for a few years by Rick Valenta at UQ. And this, again, COP is very topical with some of the announcements in the press and the global movements around companies, is that modifying factors are really one of the material inhibitors for realisation of these deposits. So of the top 40 deposits since 2019, assessed, only 2 have gone to production. And you can see that there's many factors that influence that, and they're all different. So they're common factors, but they're different impacts depending on the nature of the project that's going on. And the challenging thing as well is understanding that each and any factor by itself is manageable, but it's when they interact with each other and it becomes a multi-factor risk, that how do you understand how they're going to interact with each other, and what are the consequences of that? Because all you need is not be able to get permits or water or other things that go with it, and the project either can't go forward, or if it can go forward, it's constrained. And that's a material risk when projects are looking for the technically feasible option. But the reality is that sometimes, and this happens between resource and reserve statements, is that modifying factors will come to light directly or indirectly or cumulatively and downgrade a reserve statement. Now, that's a real concern for shareholders, obviously, and investors, but for all stakeholders, because if something then needs to be de-scoped or reduced, then that changes potentially some of the expectations or the agreements or the obligations that are there. And not to be a downer on people, but it's only getting harder, unfortunately. The world is becoming more complicated and more complex. Easiest way to say it is all the easy stuff to dig has been dug out of the ground. It's either now really complex, it's in jurisdictions, we just heard that from the last presenter, in which there's a lot of complexity around other factors, or it's more complicated, in which you've got to deal with depth and grade issues, which then obviously exacerbates surface disruption and pieces that go with it. So this isn't a new problem and a new challenge, but it does need to does provide an opportunity to reframe the thinking and understand where we're going. And again, it was referenced earlier around the projections around waste production that would be required to meet the future copper demands. These considerations are absolutely material. And, you know, I suppose trying to get through the presentation to be able to give a high level summary of this, this is certainly not unique to the resources sector. And there's huge opportunities to learn from other projects in other jurisdictions and other sectors. But you know, there's some text there around the performance of how things are going, but the overarching theme and the understandings of where things where there's huge opportunity to de-risk is around understanding perspective. If you've got an inside view of your project that's not reconciled with the outside view of how people perceive you, or what your context is, or what their risk appetites are, that asymmetry can really create friction for risk or misalignment. That means when everyone's listening and hearing, they might not be hearing the same thing. And that really, in large, complex, multi-generational projects, is really something that needs to be considered there. And the last one is thank you. And if people want to understand more around this area and how it's being looked at a structural level within some of the resource disclosure codes, you can look up an article that's been put out recently in the AusIMM bulletin. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you so much for that. Everybody, round of applause for the fantastic Jeff Deans. Absolutely brilliant. Now, Jeff, we do have time for a couple of questions with your wonderful self. But just to start with, so I loved your inside and outside diagram that you showed just then. And I think that, you know, from a personal perspective, I'm originally a geologist, and so I mean I love everything that is there to do with the technical aspects of the rocks, etc. as well. But then I also am absolutely fascinated by, say, the perceptions of local communities or indigenous peoples, or what about the infrastructure, and if we do manage to unlock this project, what can that do with regards to, say, the infrastructure for that region? So there's almost like lots of intersecting inside views that come together. Do you feel from that geological or that technical perspective that we are getting better at acknowledging other perspectives? And with that, do you feel that we are moving forwards in terms of understanding, okay, well, which projects are a goer, rather than having a list of 20 and actually there are only 2 on there that it was actually worth all the effort that went into the geology in the first place? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's the right question, but I'd answer it. It's probably a bit more nuanced than that, is to understand what needs to be true to justify the expenditure to be able to allow, and, you know, when we're talking about de-risking, is that you're doing resource drilling and you've got enough information there to go, yes, we think we're onto something here. Lifting your eyes a bit and looking at the, you're getting a bit of an outside view and understanding, okay, what needs to be true to be able to meet those things. And there's a level of subtlety there between being able to meet the preconditions. So is there reasonable prospects to get water, power, the agreements you need to be able to build a tailing storage facility, you know, all the enabling processing and non-processing infrastructure that goes with it. And if there's reasonable prospects for those things and there's a pathway to do those things, then, you know, that future capital expenditure is probably not at risk. Whereas, you know, you can unfortunately capitalize a lot of, infill drilling and resource drilling without having some of those preconditions fully addressed. And again, the renewable sector's absolutely finding there's a few learnings coming out of that sector where it's all about the energy resource, and then they're like, oh great, now we need to get it to market. And it's quite topical in Australia at the moment around power lines. There's projects that are really struggling to be able to get the enabling infrastructure to bring their commodities to market effectively. So there's lessons there, but again, it's not necessarily an ingredients issue. I'd suggest it's a recipe issue, is to say, can you bring forward some assessments earlier to be able to de-risk that expenditure?
So why aren't we doing it? So everybody promised to update their codes in 2021, and we have the video proof of those different countries around the world saying by the end of 2021, JORC will have been updated to include a kind of revised set of expectations with regards to modifying factors. And I'm being especially intentionally emotive with regards to this. What's stopping us from actually doing it?
I don't know is the short answer, but I do, there was a little thing called COVID that came along, and there's been a few other factors that have probably modified that work. So I'm not sure at the moment, but it's an opportunity, and it's timely to be able to talk about this, because especially with the orientation, the ESG factors are modifying factors. And, take, for example, water, that's a modifying factor. Now it's a technical factor for production and mine design for drainage and all those sorts of things, but it's also an ESG factor at the same time around disclosure and reporting. So depending on how things are framed, but I suppose my personal view would be rather doing it slowly and well considered is in everyone's best interest, because that if not, why not orientation to resource disclosure is challenging. If you have to try and disclose every scenario under the sun as part of that, that's probably not practical or value accretive for projects. So there's a materiality consideration there that needs to be worked through.
And so with that, Jeff, so final question, I promise. In terms of, as you mentioned just now, it's probably best to go like more slowly, but more considered. So you're incorporating a lot of those data sets earlier on. So therefore it is reducing the total potential for unknowns later on, or us to be surprised by something later on in that the value chain or the life cycle of that particular asset. Now, the problem is, of course, we're in this race to say, hang on a second, we need to be able to provide X number more tons of copper or cobalt or lithium or whatever for the energy transition. Is there actually a factor here of actually by going slower, we can actually get there faster? Because if it's going to take us 17 years or whatever it is to get from finding that rock to opening that mine anyway, actually by taking a bit more time now, we might be able to get there faster than just going, oh, I think that asset is where we want to focus on. So actually taking the time to collect that data now and weeding out the assets that perhaps won't make it or don't have the potential for other opportunities included will actually allow us to get where we need to go faster in the long run. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's, and again, it goes back to the codes orientations around this is effectively providing a framework and a schedule to be able to disclose where things are and what needs to be true for the value to be realised. It's not making an assessment on, the validity of projects. It's just saying, look, how do we understand where things are, what needs to be true, so that again, when people have got different perspectives, then they can look at that against their risk appetite and their value drivers and make a decision, because there may be projects or commodities that may not have the definition that people traditionally might like, but at the end of the day, that comes down to risk appetite and perspective. If it's worth the go, there's nothing stopping people.
Okay, fantastic, brilliant. So with that, thank you very much, Jeff. Everyone, round of applause for the fabulous Jeff Deans. Absolutely brilliant. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually stick in this world of geology. And we're going to welcome to our virtual stage now, we're going to welcome Mark Burnett. So Mark, if you want to start sharing your slides, now is a good moment. Now, Mark is also an expert in this area, and I'm sure he will have something to say with regards to the updating of those different codes of governance that sit there with regards to initially the geology, but as you've just heard from Jeff, they are much broader than just what the rocks might be in the ground. They go well beyond all of that. And there's been a huge amount of evolution in them over the last few years. And as John has said into the chat, the European version of this was updated to include those sustainability aspects over the last few years. But Mark is going to talk to us really focusing in on that mining project risk and building on what we've heard earlier on today. So Mark, we're not seeing your slides yet, but I'm going to, no, he's
Yep.
sharing them now, which
Strange.
is great.
They are shared according to me. Let
Okay.
me try it again.
There we go. Yeah.
Okay,
There
brilliant.
we go. Perfect. So everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Mark Burnett. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. Hi, all. I'm going to turn on my camera very soon because it distracts me seeing my head bump around like Max Headroom on the side. So there I go. I'll turn it on when we get to Q&A. Sarah, if I get to the 10-minute mark, please wave frantically so I stop rabbiting away. So I guess the first question in terms of updates in JORC, it has been a very bumpy and long, tedious ride. I'm not part of the JORC committee. However, I am part of PERC and CRISCO. So the latest update is that the discussion document will be available end of June or July. There has been some delays with the regulators in Australia. The problem is with most of our reporting codes that we use in the West, they either have to go through a stock exchange or they need to go through some degree of legislation, be that as it may. Anyway, I'm going to be getting back to probably more basic things, more what do we all need to be reminded of as geologists. I mean, we all get really excited about the energy transition and all these new exotic mineral species that we're going to start playing with, and that is going to move us away from a dependence on a carbon-based economy. So I need to acknowledge my co-authors for this presentation. So General Manager, and then my other colleague, Justin. Now, the whole point of what I'm going to be presenting is nothing new. I mean, we're all familiar with it, but a lot of the times as I'm reviewing projects, people get really excited with what's going forward, but tend to forget some of the really basic stuff. And in the excitement to get that new project on the go, we tend to forget some things. But the first thing we need to really understand is a lot of the times we misunderstand, and thank you very much to the previous speaker for discussing this, we really misunderstand the difference between risk and uncertainty. Most of the time, what we're looking at in the geological or geosciences space is actually uncertainty. It's very difficult to quantify. We don't know because every deposit is new, every deposit is unique, every situation is unique. However, humans being what we are, we tend to default to familiar terms and language. So most people, when you talk about uncertainty, automatically translate this to risk. So risk we can actually quantify and put a mathematical number to it. But for the sake of brevity, I'll just use risk because that is what all our standard reporting codes refer to as we're going forwards. So the way that we tend to try and do this from an exploration and a mining point of view, because we are very much profit driven in the West. We don't have a command and control economy like effectively the Chinese have a modified version. Obviously, the Soviet Union did have a command and control economy where the state is subsidizing most expenditure. Now, obviously that money has to come from somewhere. And you can see what happened to the Soviet economy and the collapse of that because effectively of potentially Western economic models not being followed. Now, I know we can get into a whole discussion about economics and the pros and cons of a capitalist model, but the sad reality is if we are going to try and finance these things, you have to be cash positive or the money needs to come from somewhere. So if we go back to a standard capitalist-based model, to try and mitigate our risk or uncertainty, we tend to start looking at a whole load of very early stage models where Sarah and company tend to get involved in the discussions we've had. How does that impact on local communities? How does that impact on environments? We tend to see in the West, because we are a developed economies, we moved into quaternary or knowledge-based economies, we don't like this fact of a big hole in the ground, and we tend, while legislation has tended to push this out into other countries where they are developing economies or emerging economies, and we tend not to see the environmental impact or the social impact that mining activities tend to have. But as we start moving through what we refer to as the mining value curve, the anticipation is we start mitigating or dropping our risk or lowering it down. So we go from a whole load of potential targets, which you can see in the on the far left-hand side, and we move it through to a single project. Now, statistically, we can quantify this. I'm in the process of writing up a paper for the CIM conference in October, where we can try and, at least on a global scale, try and track down or put a number to this. So the numbers that start coming out in the academic research, which is available, is success rates for general projects. So something going from exploration to making money is approximately 1% of any exploration projects will turn into a mine. If you're looking to get a tier 1 project, now again, the definitions of tier 1 vary from company to company, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, you're looking at less than 0.3%, again, depending on who you're looking at. But all of these, when we're moving through a mining value curve, we run into a whole load of risks and uncertainties. And you can see some of these. I mean, people write entire PhDs on trying to tease out what can go wrong and how can we mitigate our uncertainties and our risks. Now, I'm going to be focusing on specifically some of the geological aspects, but you can see there's a whole variety of things that come into play, and a lot of these are all cross-connected. So it's very difficult for us to just say it's geology. We need to understand the impact of geology on acid mine water drainage, the impact of the minerals which are going to go to our tailings dam. How do people get involved in all of this? Because obviously people are the basis of what we're doing. People have different psychologies, there's different cultures, both a culture from a country that you come from, but as well as a corporate culture. How does that work? How does knowledge get transferred between people? Are your local communities inspired, and are they robust and resilient to changes that happen when the mine is finished? What is the impact on the environment, both from a global point of view, but also local point of view? Understanding commodity exchange rates. I mean, everything is really complicated, and it becomes very difficult to start pulling things out in individual little baskets. Except that's what I'm probably going to do, because obviously we've got to try and focus somewhere. Now, specifically when we start looking at geological risks, we can tie it down to effectively the big 6, of which I'm really going to try and focus and touch on the ones which have been outlined in, well, I would call it green, other people would probably call it turquoise or aqua or some other variation of not the whitish stuff down at the bottom. Now, one of the first challenges that we face, and again, this is where from a conceptual or a cognitive model, a lot of people don't understand or can conceptualize in the mental model that more drilling and more data does not guarantee that you will get a project. On more than one occasion, and I'm sure as geologists we're all very familiar with this, we just tend not to talk about it too much, is that sometimes the more you drill, the worse your project gets, because you discover that those nice continuous deposits or veins or shear zones are not as nice and continuous and are not as nice and mineralized as what you think it is. A lot of the times we potentially use inappropriate technology because we're running after keeping the costs as low as possible. So instead of drilling NQH core, we revert to RC drilling, and it may not be appropriate for that mineralization style. We tend to jump around from one place to other because, again, there's corporate, short quarteritism. Yeah, couldn't get that word right. But a CEO company is judged on its quarterly performance, and then you're not going to get money in unless you're showing good results. So, of course, there's always this drive to get into the market with the best results possible. And of course, then there's the cognitive dissonance, or that we just don't want to understand that this project that we've fallen in love with is just not performing like we need it to, and it becomes very, very difficult to just cut your ties and walk away. But this data then leads us into some of the other stuff, because any project or any estimation we do, because remember, these are estimates, they're not calculations, all our models are incorrect. To steal a phrase, just some models are more correct than others. But this data and the hypotheses that we start using, we then lead into the mineral resource. Now, again, as has been previously discussed, a mineral resource must show or must demonstrate that there's potential economic viability in that resource. So not only do we need to have robust geological modeling, we need to have robust data, we need to understand the economics of the space that we're operating in. So again, we can see, from example, the platinum market, there's now been a collapse in the platinum price, partially due to changing technology, partially due to supply and demand, but now there is no demand for that. So a lot of the projects or the operations which are currently producing platinum have now got to scale back. So recent announcements is a South African mining company is going to retrench 3,900 workers because of the metal price being lower. So we, again, as geologists or geoscientific practitioners, need to understand the larger environment that we work in. It's all very well and good talking about numbers, but there's real people that will get impacted if our work has not been done correctly and robustly. Which leads us through to some of the other stuff. When we're looking at geological models, a lot of the times we now get fixated on software to do the things, and we run the numbers into a computer. The computer generates, for example, a very interesting model like you can see on the screen, and we walk away and say, well, the computer said so, this is based on the data, this must be the geology model that we have got. Now, any geologist looking at that should hopefully stand back and say, yep, maybe not. But the problem is this is what we tend to do as people, because again, there's time factors and business factors and cost factors, and you rush to get to market to try and get something out there, to try and get people or keep people interested in your model. If it is something which everybody is excited about, like graphite was, lithium is now picking up again because China's now got some new economic incentives for people to buy electrical vehicles. So again, there's going to be another demand to get to market, to get the money, to advance your project, to move it to the next stage. But it's understanding how all of these things work together and understanding how our software works. Again, as I said, with the time pressures, economic pressures, as much as we'd like to do it, we tend to get fixated. And as was mentioned yesterday, because of the cyclical nature of the minerals economy, pale, stale, boring white males like me are going to be retiring soon. There's now a knowledge gap. Where does that knowledge come from for the next generation to understand that, as is seen here, this is probably not an appropriate model for you to try and raise oodles of cash on from the stock exchange? But we also tend to forget there's this other small thing, just understanding density. Are we measuring specific gravity, or are we measuring something else? How are we going to do it? Is the methodology and technique we're using appropriate? Because at the end of the day, the density that you use is going to be a function, or as part of the function of the metal that you're going to assume you're going to be able to extract from your deposits in the ground. If you get your density wrong, it will have significant knock-on effects. Now, again, this is one of the things which we tend to ignore because doing it is a tedious and time-consuming process. Some of the more advanced techniques may cost you a bit of time, cost you a bit of money to do them, and then you have to feed it all back into it. Now, to digress is quite a salutary tale of a mining company which will remain nameless, who were noticing a discrepancy between the metal and the tonnage that they were getting in the plant versus the plan. They eventually decided to go and check the densities and discovered that the density that they planned the entire mine on was not the density that they're actually receiving. Now, the way that the company treated this was they just ignored the entire issue and just said that they have a discrepancy and it's probably due to metal being lost in the underground environment, and they continued with that story for at least another 10 years until they sold the asset to another company. We also need to understand our metallurgy. How are we going to be processing this? So getting into the study of geometallurgy, if we're starting to look at a total extraction of all potential metals and minerals from our deposits, which we would need to for a circular economy. How do we do this? Are we optimizing our processing in a way which will extract everything? Because what a lot of people tend to forget is that if you extract one metal or material, it will have a knock-on effect down the processing stream. So you're not going to be able to get a 90% or an 80% recovery of every single metal and mineral which is present in your deposit. Some of the things are not going to be extractable, or they're not going to be economically extractable, which then gets you into the situation, are you going to be looking for government grants, or are you going to then be looking at cross-subsidizing from your primary metal stream to allow you to recover some of these secondary, really critical metals and minerals, which we would need for our energy transition going forwards. Now, when you start getting into a little bit deeper in terms of this discussion, a lot of the times you'll find that some of our very specific critical and strategic metals are actually in and of themselves don't have sufficient mass, to coin a bad term, that they'll be economically viable as a standalone. So they have to be cross-subsidized somehow. And again, a salutary case in point is a lot of the metals that we need are byproducts and co-products from lead and zinc. So as soon as the zinc price or lead price goes down, you are not going to be getting all the very, very interesting seleniums and stuff coming out which you need for your high-tech industry. So a lot of the times our boring gray bulk commodities are actually critical to what we want to do in the future. But of course, with these, not only do we have health hazards, as you can see, that come by with some of these elements that we're trying to extract, we also start seeing, as we move through our mining value chain or our project development chain, there's a whole load of variability that can occur. Now, unfortunately, I haven't been able to track down this slide. This is one of those legacy slides which comes into presentations. I'd love to know where it comes from because I think it's really good. But what you can see from this is invariably we see positive and negative variance coming around our true value. In the vast majority of projects I've ever looked at, and again, probably because of human nature and the way that the economics of mining are undertaken in the Western environment, the projects tend to be on the optimistic side. So what invariably happens is when you start doing mining and doing processing, you tend not to get what you anticipated because of the tend to be more optimistic to try and get your project through the stage gates. Now, how do we go and compensate for this? Well, one of the ways to do this is potentially to start looking at risk matrix evaluations and to start looking at trying to quantify to a certain degree what the risk is. Again, the problem with any of these risk analyses is that it's all highly subjective and it's based on experience, and there is a certain degree of pressure. For example, if you're doing this for a financial institution, the financial institution invariably has already said they want to give you the cash, and then invariably that sort of tends to translate back into a slightly more optimistic view on a project than a pessimistic view on the project. So how do we tend to try and quantify these? And this is now said firmly with my PERC, CRISCO, and UNRMS hats on. The way that the Western world at least is trying to compensate for this is having listed companies reporting through to the stockholders and potential investors using a reporting code or standard. Now, in this, the competent person or the person signing off on the report should, thanks Eric, should in and of themselves be putting sufficient information out there for any investor to be able to understand the risks and uncertainties that they will be taking on if they decide to invest in that company. Now, currently, there are 15 countries which have signed up for CRISCO. The most recent one is PMRC, who are the Philippines. They just joined last year. There's a number of countries in the process of joining. Unfortunately, until they join, I can't really discuss which companies they are. But also to just go back in terms of, well, what are the most common codes used to report resources and reserves or our projects that we want to invest in. JORC, in a study done in 2019, had 51% of all technical reports reported according to JORC. 48% done according to the Canadian standard, so NI 43-101, which is actually the regular legislative requirement, not actually the code. And then the Canadian, the American and SAMREC, so the South African ones, came in with less than 1%. So the conclusions of all of this, well, again, as we start moving through anything that we do, there's going to be a whole load of risks and uncertainty, which we need to try and understand and mitigate. That will cost time and money. And while our pure geological risks are overshadowed by non-technical, which we've been doing a lot of discussion around that, they will and do have significant influence on the projects that we do. And that is me concluded my talk. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Mark. Everyone, round of applause for the fantastic Mark Burnett. Absolutely brilliant. Mark, there is a question for you in the Q&A that asks you, where did you get that 1% of exploration projects turn into a mine? I would love to know the source of this, because there is a world of discussion that goes into what do these stats actually mean and where do they come from. Do you have a quick answer to that, or shall I let you go for it in the Q&A?
Oh, no, I've tracked it down. There's actually 3 references. One was a study done by BHP in 2015, which apparently was in a AusIMM conference proceeding. There was then subsequent studies by 2 Spanish authors, which I've tracked down. And then there's a third one, which I think was done based on Canadian data, which again, I'm in the process of trying to track down. So these numbers tend to get thrown around. They are documented, but for some reason, people tend not to put the references in any of the discussions that they're doing. So I've tracked down the 3 papers. As I said, for the CIM conference, I'm going to be writing a paper on risk and putting all those references in. If I can find them, I'll share them in the chat as well.
Fantastic.
And sorry, I saw you note
amazing.
that we're getting to 50 and I missed the first cough.
It's so good. It's all good. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. Everyone, round of applause for the fabulous
Thanks
Mark.
all.
Absolutely brilliant. Cool. Okay, so straight on to our next fabulous speaker. And he's also got a bit of a geological background to him as well. Does Master Victor, who is going to be joining us right now. Victor, if you need to share slides, now is a good moment to do all of that. Something just as well to make sure that everybody's on the same page here. The last few talks have basically been geologists admitting or sharing with the world that we don't know what is in the ground. So although we're bringing to the table all of those technical aspects, from that very basic point of the technicalities and the physical science of what we're doing, we are starting from a world of extreme uncertainty. So we don't know what is in the ground, but that of course makes it a bit more fun, especially if we're trying to look for what is the full potential or the full opportunities, not just from the geological sense, but things like societal development, etc. sense as well, if we are to go and unlock some of those natural resources. But with that, I'm going to pass you over to the fantastic Victor, who's going to be talking about rethinking mining, embracing technology and social responsibility. Take it away, Victor.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's an honor to be here. And indeed, as you said, there is a lot of uncertainty in the decisions that we normally are called to make. So let me start by introducing myself. My background, as you said, is on geology. I started my career as a mining geologist, working in one of these copper deposits that were mentioned by Anita, not in the US, but in Spain and Portugal. And later on, I moved back to the university to learn a bit more about management. And I have the opportunity to manage mining projects, basically at the exploration and also permitting stages in Africa, in Europe, and also in South America. Speaking now about the International Raw Materials Observatory, in fact, that's my hosting house, the place where I work as a Secretary General. The observatory is a not-for-profit organization. It was created with the European Union money back in 2017. And as the name says, it observes best practice in the raw material sector. So we look to exploration, we look to mining, we look to the processing and to recycling, and basically we try to collect all these good examples of best practice, and basically we display them for the public, and we position ourselves as an honest broker. As I said, we were created by European money, and I'm talking about some research that we are now doing, also funded by the European Union. And what you see now is the call for the grant that I'll be talking about. And this was a grant basically asking, can we mine in environmentally protected areas? And as you see, this is a very tough subject, and it's explained by the fact that the European Union has basically two sources or two options, if you want, for sourcing raw materials. One is to obtain them by trade. And of course, we realize now that this is becoming more complex, not only because of the resources constraints, I mean, resource nationalism, but also because of competition. As it was mentioned by Guillaume about DRC, it's not only the European Union buyers that are there. We have Chinese buyers, we have Lebanese companies, we have companies from all over the world. Even a few weeks ago, I was realizing that in the Chilean copper sector, we have now Indian companies trying to invest in Chile. So competition for resources is becoming more global, and that explains why the European Union is trying to advance domestic mining. The problems. Well, one of the problems is that if you look to the European land surface, we realize that we have a lot of protected areas. And that happens because basically after the 80s, with the globalization, we decided to rely on resources that were on imports on one hand. On the other hand, we also decided to invest more and more on nature conservation. So some European funded programs like the LIFE program has already 40 years of experience. And in fact, many municipalities and many regions, they decided basically to try to enhance the landscape and the traditional ways of life, and that also opens the way for new businesses like tourism. So this is the case, as you have seen in this map. On the center, you have the protected areas in the Iberian Peninsula. And this is very recent, this map. It was published by the European Environmental Agency back in October 2023. And on the left-hand side, you see a map of critical raw materials occurrences. Of course, that explains the challenge that we have and the question that I made at the beginning. So can we mine in an environmentally protected area? The problems, as it's not only about land use, we can also mention the fact that in Europe, the biggest deposits were already exploited in the past. So the deposits that are left are normally small, and that's a technological challenge. But we also have a strong public opposition to mining. So we can say that Europeans are against mining in Europe, of course, because we want to have access to raw materials. And this is happening all across Europe. So it can be in Romania, it can be in Serbia, it can be in Portugal. I believe that the Portuguese case is even more strange because you see that this image is from protest in the streets against lithium mining. And these people, they don't know, and I know that because I was in a parliament audition a couple of years ago, and many people in that auditions, they were against the opening of new lithium minings without realizing that Portugal has been, for decades, the biggest European producer of lithium. So, and they didn't believe that when I told them that we have lithium mines, and if you want to access the environmental impacts of lithium mining, we should have here the people that lives nearby these existing mines. And many people in the room were telling me, you are lying, we are not producing lithium. So there is a sort of disconnect in Europe about the need for the raw materials and the fact that basically we don't want them. So we are running this research project about extraction of critical raw materials in environmentally protected areas. I would say that what is novel in this approach, we are looking to best practice, so that explains the benchmarks. But we are also talking with populations living in environmentally protected areas. So we are reaching these people and trying to understand with them under which conditions mining might be acceptable. We have an interesting case from Estonia, for example, for a phosphate deposit that is located inside an environmental protected area. And if you ask these people if they were in favor of exploring and extracting that deposit 10 years ago, they will probably told you no way. But now they are considering that yes, that might happen under, of course, certain conditions. And one of the reasons is the geopolitical landscape that has changed. So because they don't want to rely on phosphate imports from Russia. So this is part of the approach, and I'd like to share with you some of the questions that we are discussing with the populations living in these environmental protected areas. So we are assessing 5 different countries and 5 different communities, and some of the, if you want, critical choices now, bridging to the name of this workshop that we are trying to have in these conversations is, for instance, what metals shall we consider? If you have an environmental protected area and if you want to go there for gold, should you be allowed? Of course, that raises not only the economic questions, but also the ethical ones. In my opinion, gold should be always a no way, because we don't really need gold for the energy transition. We need it for the banks and for jewelry. But despite the fact that gold is one of the metals that is receiving more money from funding for exploration, but gold should be a no way. But even in some of these critical raw materials, let me raise the case for lithium. Do you really need, or do you really believe that lithium will be key for the energy storage, let's say in 10 years from now? Because technology is changing. Probably copper will be more relevant than lithium. So this sort of questions should be raised. So what's the metal that we are looking for? And of course, what's the natural values that we are protecting in these environmental protected areas? Because in some cases, if you are trying to protect the landscape, and if the mine is invisible, for instance, if it is underground, if all the waste is managed down below, if that's possible, so in principle, we shouldn't be having as many problems. Also, another key question is the size of the mine. Do we want a big mine? And this question was raised because we realized that in some industries, and the example is coming from fish farming, that if you establish a big fish farm industry nearby a fisherman community, you probably will kill the community. On the other hand, if you establish a small, or let's say a medium-sized fish farm, it will enable the fisherman community to thrive and prosper at the same time. So the size of the mine, the resource that we are extracting, all these questions are coming into the discussion. We realize also, just to share with you some preliminary results about the narratives. This is not news, I mean, but now it's documented. So we realize that, for instance, environmental groups, they have a problem, because on one hand, they want to speed up the energy transition. On the other hand, they realize that that requires, it's more material intense, so it requires more materials. And they are also saying that we should, on one hand, be more fair with the communities where these minerals are now being sourced. So they basically raise the issues of the global South extractivism, but they also don't want the minerals to be extracted in Europe. So we have all these patterns. An important one is the last one in the line, saying that we realize that some of these communities, they are saying, yes, you are coming here, you are asking questions, you are listening to us, but in the end, you don't care. Meaning that as a government, you do whatever you want. So in the end, even if we say no, our negative perspective is not considered, and you do whatever you want. And this creates, again, distrust and big problems. So part of those discussions also address the industry. And we realize that industry needs new business models. What you have there is a sort of mapping of possible approaches coming from, let's say, the linear to the circular economy perspective. I very much enjoy the first one, closing resource loops, meaning that instead, and we have at least one example in Europe of a company that was basically a miner, and they started having recycling together with mining. So you can say to these populations now, I'll be opening a mine now, so relying on primary sources of the metal I'll be extracting. But if this is coupled with recycling, meaning that my source of the metals will be the mine for perhaps 10, 15 years. But once this is coupled with recycling, once I'm receiving back some of the metals that, or the products with the metal that I'm extracting back, and the recycling operation can stay here forever, meaning that we are not talking about creating jobs for 10 or 15 years and leaving. We are talking about staying with the community and supporting the community for many long years. And of course, that comes with also different levels of social benefits. We are talking about housing, we are talking about education, and so on. We have examples already, not only from the mining sector. Rolls-Royce, for instance, they moved from selling engines to leasing engines. And of course, that was coupled with the need of recovering rhenium, that was critical raw materials for the engine. And this is it. So, Sarah, I'll be looking for questions and here to support you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Victor. A round of applause from all of us for the fabulous Victor. Victor, just with regards to this, and we'll leave this slide up on the screen for a few minutes in case people want to take a picture of that QR code. Victor, often we find that these discussions can get incredibly emotional. And because they touch on things that are very, very personal to many of us. And I'm thinking back to what you were talking about there in Portugal in terms of lithium. What can we be doing to help actually take that level of engagement away from that emotional strife and actually into more constructive territory? Have you come across any tactics or ways in which we can do that to try and engage in meaningful conversation rather than in conversation that is driven by emotions?
That's very difficult. So what we realize, I mean, you have possible several approaches, but we realize that for people that have all their life investment in a specific activity, it could be farming or tourism or whatever, if you are saying that you are disrupting their life, of course they are emotional. It's important to say that I do believe that the mines of the future will need to be completely invisible. So the metal should add a high value in order to pay for the investment. You need to have it completely underground, with no signs of, let's say, of presence. And we also probably need, in these social or economical models, we also need to consider perhaps transforming stakeholders into shareholders. Again, we have examples, for instance, wind farms. In some cases, not only they rent the land for the wind generator, but they also transform the community not in a stakeholder, but in shareholders, meaning that they open the capital, and suddenly people realizes, okay, I'll be having some economic benefit altogether, and that might be helpful. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Victor. And I think a lot of what you're saying resonates with some of what we discussed yesterday in session 1, when we're thinking about different business models in terms of the use of the land itself, which is really exciting. So with that, everybody, I encourage you to put your hands together for the fantastic Victor. And we're going to go straight into our next talk. Victor, I'm just going to stop your sharing of your screen. There we go. And we're going to welcome to our virtual stage Louis, who it's not his first showing at a Responsible Raw Materials Conference. No, in fact, Louis has been very gracious and worked with us in the past, obviously on slightly different topic areas. Louis, I don't know if you have slides that you wish to share. So now is a good time to be doing all of that.
Yeah.
And
can you hear me well?
Yep, it's beginning. It's thinking about it. There we go. We can see your PowerPoint at the moment. And we're just sharing it at the moment. Excellent. So everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Louis Marchal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for having me again to this conference. I'm really happy to be engaging again with this audience. So I was sort of asked to focus on the sort of topic that you can see on your screen now. Responsible is reliable, which is sort of turned into our main selling point over the past 18 months, I would say. This is sort of something that we came up on the occasion of the first IEA Critical Minerals Summit last September, but I'll get back to that. Really the point and the purpose of the presentation is to emphasize the need to invest in governance, I would say, in the broadest possible sense of the term, to actually make the future production and trade of those critical minerals resources more reliable. And ultimately, the idea is that it would benefit everyone, so in all countries. So I'll get started with a couple of slides on our work, and I hope it's in full screen and everything. I can't see that. It's great, fantastic. So I'm guessing a number of you are familiar with this. Just wanted to further to take this occasion to emphasize a couple of points. It's a very long document with a very long title, but it aims to be doing two things primarily. From a technical standpoint, help. It says gold, but it's not gold. I should have updated that. It helps companies integrate into their management systems due diligence processes that will help them map their supply chains, identify potentially the provenance of their mineral resources, collect information on companies in those supply chains, run risk assessments, and develop mitigation strategies that ultimately will help them remain engaged in those supply chains. And I think that's a key point for our conversation today. This guidance is now almost 15 years old, and that's the second point. Its aim has always been to promote responsible investment in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. At that point in time, so 15 years ago, and sadly, it's still very much relevant, but the idea was that through investment and responsible investments in the extractive sector in those areas, companies and stakeholders had a way to actually influence the political situation in those countries and invest money and make sure that the extractive sector could turn into a stabilization factor for those conflict-affected and high-risk areas. The original area of implementation was the Great Lakes regions of Africa, and we're still very much involved in there. But I find it really interesting 15 years further down the line to actually see that this objective, the strategic objective, is extremely relevant for today's conversation, meaning that, and I'll get back to that, we all know that a number of those CRM are located in, let's just call them high-risk jurisdiction. Sadly, it's probably going to be increasingly the case. So what companies need at this point in time is guidance to help them navigate those complex environments and remain engaged, so that they know that they can invest millions of dollars or euros and not be threatened by the prospect of having to leave out the country or the jurisdiction as soon as they identify any sort of risk. But I'll come back to that. Very quickly, it applies to all mineral resources. It applies globally, and it applies those recommendations to all companies in the supply chain, which means that we're working with small, medium, large mining companies, then trading companies, refining companies, processing companies, downstream trading companies, and then ultimately any sort of downstream producer, be they automotive manufacturers or tech, or increasingly other parts of the economy. But those recommendations are for companies to implement, which means that most of our work entails helping companies and industry association make sense of our recommendations and implement them practically. And that's obviously when the rubber hits the road and the most interesting conversation take place. I think over the past 15 years, we've been able to develop solid relations, trust relations with companies, and in return, they kindly share with us their practical challenges making our job very interesting, because we're actually here to help them implement those recommendations and ultimately ensure that they have some form of impact. That's a lot of pictures. I was talking about the minerals guidance, which is at the center of your document. I should have said earlier on, what it aims to do is help companies first prioritize identifications of risks related to conflict financing, serious abuses of human rights, and serious economic crimes. So corruption, bribery, tax evasion, money laundering, terrorist finance. But by no means does it instruct companies to stop there. It's always been very clear that they're supposed to be looking for additional risks, and in particular environmental risk. Reason why we have developed the handbook that you see there, with the support of the German Federal Agency for Environment, and it's now widely available. And basically what it does is take the due diligence journey a step further, providing detailed information on the nature of risk that companies, in particular downstream companies, should be looking for in their supply chain of critical or other mineral resources. The other types of documents, so on your left, the guidelines for multinational enterprises and due diligence guidance for RBC are sort of the overarching recommendations for business. So they're sector agnostic. The rest is really specific to the mining sector in particular, extractive sector in general, for the stakeholder engagement guide. And over the years, we have actually developed a number of small practical documents that any company can actually use to better understand what we are asking on a specific set of issues. So corruption, child labor, we have one on artisanal and small-scale mining. We have now this environmental due diligence handbook. So as I just explained, this is what the handbook entails to do. It is a rather short and hopefully handy document. It's accessible on our website, so please do pay attention. But again, gives me the opportunity to clarify once more that by no means did we ever intend to send a signal that the only thing that matters is conflict financing and serious abuse of human rights. It's much more complex than that. It's actually so complex that detecting environmental risks may actually take you to the identification of corruption risk and serious human rights abuses risks. All those risks at some point end up being connected. And the idea of due diligence and the methodology behind it is that step by step, you actually collect information and use your brain and try to understand if that's actually an indication of risk. And if it is the case, what is it that I can do as a responsible company? Am I allowed to remain engaged in this specific environment? And if so, how? And that's what makes the work so interesting. Some drivers, I won't elaborate too much on that, but the OECD standard is a voluntary guidance, as you know, but it's been turned into mandatory requirements quite a lot, either by industry associations and market makers like the London Metal Exchange or the LBMA and others, but increasingly as well by regulators. So in the US, in the EU, in the UAE, in the case of gold, well, that was quite an achievement, because it really demonstrates that this instrument is not intended to be used only by OECD countries. But all in all now, we have about 15 global supply chain of mineral resources that have or will soon embrace OECD due diligence approaches, and they're listed here. And this is because of, again, mandatory requirements, either dictated by market makers and or by governments. The most recent one, obviously, is the EU battery regulation, which covers lithium, natural graphite, cobalt, and nickel. We had cobalt and nickel already sort of covered through the LME, but we've now sort of added two, and more are in the pipeline. We're working a lot with MICA, as Sarah and Ludivine know. So yeah, the list keeps on expanding, which is very encouraging. Also interesting to note that we do have some serious cooperation with Chinese stakeholders. It's obviously was very difficult to pretend that all Chinese companies pay an interest in those issues, but there are some real meaningful, serious conversations going on with a number of Chinese companies throughout the supply chain, from mining to trading to end users and downstream companies. Turning to critical and transition minerals, as we like to call them, just a note on that, we're trying to refrain from the critical mineral terminology, which carries a heavy sort of a burden. Producing countries don't like that terminology, and we also agree that it doesn't help with making the conversation easier. What's critical may be automatically linked to national sovereign interests. And of course, when our intention is to make sure that everyone gets its share of the pie, when you address and you tackle that conversation through the critical minerals terminology, the conversation is not beginning in a nice way. So we'd rather use transition minerals. That's quite a heavy slide, but this is taken out of our briefing notes that we produced, as I said, in September, called Responsible is Reliable. And basically the idea here is, and sorry, cut me if I'm getting too long, but the idea is really to emphasize as much as we can that investing in governance at large is a factor of security of supply. There is obviously a lot of interest from a number of stakeholders, including some of our own countries, to cut some corners and take out what some of policymakers tend to call red tapes. We strongly believe that this is a mistake that might help you access deposit in the short term, but in the medium to long term, you're creating a big risk to your production pipeline. Because honestly, if you invest in a country where corruption is rife and there's absolutely zero social license to operate, and you have non-state armed groups running around the country, and you don't do anything about it, it will come back and bite you at some point. So this is what we've tried to really emphasize in this document. The other thing that we are constantly insisting on, and I already flagged and alluded to, is what you'll see here as called as the de-risking conundrum. Basically, because of those increasingly demanding ESG ambitions that you would find in a number of policymakers' pledge, let's say, companies are actually reluctant to consider investing in complex jurisdiction. But that's not going to work for anyone. So what we always say is that it's really important to have very strong ESG ambitions and objectives. But what matters most is your roadmap to get there and clear guidance for companies on how they can navigate complex environments, which is what the OECD instruments and other provide. But what we're seeing quite a lot at the moment, unfortunately, is companies just saying, "Oh, this is really too complex. I can't be involved in that kind of jurisdiction." You may have seen what the government of the DRC has been doing recently with a company in the US. That's not helping from our perspective, getting the kind of conversation that we all need. And there's other examples of that have been developing. So that's an issue. We all need to agree, that more investment is needed. More investment is needed in high-risk jurisdiction, and the conditions for those investments need to be laid out clearly, and they are to some extent, but they need to be well understood by everyone in the supply chain as well as in the broader ecosystem of mining, of the mining industry, and that means reaching out to investors and banks and financiers. Those are the conditions that would help us open up mining jurisdiction, open up new mines in the right conditions, and secure a reliable supply of those resources in the coming decades. So that's this little figure is just an example of how what people think are local issues can very quickly turn into domestic-wide issues, and these are sort of taken from real life examples. So an issue at a local mine site can actually escalate and turn into a debate in a national assembly or parliament, that it ends up blocking every processing of mining license for an undetermined period of time. That's a very clear example of how things can go wrong for everyone. Corruption is probably one of the most overlooked risk in mineral supply chains at the moment. Everyone knows it's there, everyone knows it's big, but everyone is just limiting its efforts to some extent to what is legally required of them, and that's already very good. But that's not sufficient, which explains why we've developed this frequently asked question document available on our website, which basically pushes companies downstream to do their best efforts to identify corruption risk deep down in their supply chain and come together to find solutions. Every single big mining company that we talk to flag this corruption risk as a major impediment and a major obstacle to considering investment in a number of high-risk jurisdictions. And we fully agree with that, because it makes everything riskier. And also, corruption is often identified as a sort of victimless crime by a number of stakeholders. Everyone seems to believe that it's okay to go through corruption, but at the end of the day, it is corruption that empties state coffers, and that leaves those countries in a state of systemic poverty and leads people then to pick up their shovels and turn into artisanal miners and then encroach on large-scale mining concessions and driving insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a sort of vicious circle that may start with a big corruption case that at the moment companies, policymakers, and the broader, again, ecosystem tends to be overlooking to some extent. So we really constantly heavily emphasize this in our interventions. I will stop with a last slide, just flagging our upcoming annual conference taking place in Paris the week of 21 May. We'll have 2 days of plenary sessions, 22 and 23rd, but partner session throughout the week. We have, I think, 60 to 70 now, covering all the supply chains that I detailed earlier, potentially others as well. So some of the topics that we'll discuss, I mean, the opening sequence will be looking at government-to-government partnerships, basically trying to make sense of what I just laid out. How do you leverage those partnerships to make sure that responsible sourcing becomes an integral part of the conversation? A session on responsible finance, another on security, which is something that I failed to emphasize, but local security at mine sites is another key point of social license to operate. One session that I'm really happy that we were able to put there is responsible sand and silicates, because it's simply massive, and it's the natural resource that will be the most exploited in the future, actually, to build all the kinds of infrastructure that we all need. We'll have a specific focus on Myanmar this time, and coming back to gold, which remains one of our key points of concern, specific emphasis on illicit trade risks in gold supply chains in Latin America. So you have the registration link here there with all logistical information. It's free of charge, and the more the merrier. So you're all warmly invited to come to Paris and stay with us for the week. Thank you very much.
Louis, thank you so much. Round of applause, everybody, for Louis Marchal from the OECD. Fantastic. Now, Louis, you managed to invite all of us to Paris. I don't think any of us are going to say no if we can possibly make it there. And that list of topics that you've got look absolutely fantastic. We've got time just for one quick question, and that is around, okay, so we're hearing a lot about that governance and transparency, be it at the kind of the front end of the supply chain, so where we're looking for those rocks, where we're digging them out of the ground. When those materials then go off into the kind of more complicated processing, and then off they go into things like cars and phones, etc., that middle bit of the value chain, do you feel there's enough transparency in it, or can we do better in that area?
Well, the issue is that I think there's a number of middles, and that's what makes it more complicated. Our standard calls for an independent third-party audit to take place at the control point of the supply chain, as we call it. Let's say the physical control point. Usually it's the refiner or the smelter, and that's working quite well. But obviously, over the years and through experience, we've learned that there's actually other kind of stakeholders and actors that play a critical role in supply chains, in particular those global commodity traders. Some of them are playing the game, some others are not. So that's probably one of the biggest challenge at the moment, and sort of making sure that global commodity traders, either big or small, show up at the table and make their best efforts also to increase transparency. Transparency in global commodity trading is not necessarily an obvious thing to discuss, but it can work. And we've had some very positive example with a couple of them. So if I had to pick up one part of the supply chain that I think we need to focus our efforts on, that would be commodity trading.
Yeah, I think many of us who are dialing in at the moment are very keen to hear more about that area as well. So with that, thank you very, very much, Louis, and hopefully lots of us will see you in Paris, which would be great. Round of applause.
Hope so. Thank you
very much. Thank you. Fantastic. So loads and loads of ideas that we've been hearing about already this morning, and we've got another 2 presenters for you today who are going to share their thoughts and build on everything we've already been hearing. The first of those 2 is the fantastic Mark Camilleri, who is going to introduce himself, give us a few words of wisdom, and then I have some interview questions pre-prepared for him. So we'll have a little discussion. If any of you would like to ask us questions, please do put them into the chat or into the Q&A. And other panelists, if you've got questions for Mark, then feel free to wave at me and I'll bring you into the discussion as well. So with that, Mark, I'm going to spotlight you and let you take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sarah, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thanks everybody for taking part in this really excellent and important discussion today. By way of introduction, my name is Mark Camilleri. I'm a Canadian lawyer based in Brussels, but I'm also the president and co-founder of the Canada-EU Trade and Investment Association, or CUSHA as we like to call it, which is an organization aimed to promote the Canada-EU economic and trade agenda. So I'm really here to talk about that relationship, and specifically the Canada-EU strategic partnership on raw materials, and really discuss whether that could be a model that could be used for future EU partnerships. So a little background on the Canada-EU mining partnership. This is the Canada-EU strategic partnership on raw materials is an agreement that is between Canada and the EU, aimed at fostering cooperation in the field of raw materials through facilitating information exchanges, business opportunities between the EU, its member states, Canada, and its provinces and territories, as well as the private sector, and then also promoting exchanges between research communities. The framework, or the partnership rather, was announced between Canada and the EU in June 2021 after it received the framework was endorsed at a Leaders Summit earlier that month. It's important to remember that this particular partnership agreement falls within a broader framework, which is the Canada-EU bilateral dialogue on raw materials, which is a formal discussion, a formal dialogue that takes place under CETA, which is the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. It falls under 25.4 for CETA for those of you that want to take a look, and that's a dialogue that takes place more or less annually. It's a more formal dialogue And I think the idea from the EU's perspective was to maybe consider another dialogue that was a bit more flexible, a bit more informal, that might help support the government-to-government work that was being done with some specific actions and objectives. And this also follows the Commission's 2020 Critical Raw Materials Action Plan, which did encourage the Commission and the EU to engage in strategic partnerships with resource-rich third countries such as Canada. From the Canadian perspective, the partnership supports other objectives that Canada is advancing in the EU in terms of clean energy transition, climate action, and broader trade and investment priorities. But it's still important to bear this in mind that it's backtracked. This partnership is backtracked by under the CETA dialogue. It's important because CETA is a trade agreement, and as such, it provides a legal structure that can really backstop a more ambitious partnership on critical raw materials and others, which is a non-legally binding political framework. So with that in mind, we can talk about the partnership itself. Its overall objectives is to advance the value, security, and sustainability of trade and investment into the critical minerals and metals needed for the transition to a clean and digital economy. There are three areas of collaboration. The first is on the integration of Canada-EU raw materials value chains. The second is on science, technology, and innovation collaboration. And the third is on ESG criteria and standards. Over time, there have been some specific action plans that put in place, for example, strengthening the business opportunities for Canadian and EU businesses, closer cooperation in research and innovation, as well as more cooperation in international fora on ESG standards. So is this working? Well, I guess it depends on what you're measuring. If the intention or expectation is that Canada is going to provide EU with its critical raw materials that it needs in the short or medium term, then that's not going to happen. And but that's not what this partnership is about. It's from a perspective of de-risking and redesigning the critical minerals value chains, which is what we're talking about here. I'd say it's doing very well. So just to give some examples in terms of the integration of the Canada-EU raw materials value chains, the key outcomes of this partnership really has been to make connections between mining and processing companies, let's say, with investors. So a matchmaking role between Canada and for the Canada and the EU. And on this, I got to say they've been very successful. The last few years have seen some significant investments by EU companies in the Canadian critical raw materials value chains. To give some examples and some of the highlights, BASF's investment in Quebec for battery materials and recycling in 2022, Volkswagen's investment in a EV battery gigafactory in St. Thomas, Ontario, Umicore's installation of an electric vehicle battery manufacturing facility in Loyalist, Ontario, again in 2022. Mercedes-Benz signing a supply deal with Rocktech Lithium for the supply of lithium in 2022. And most recently, Northvolt's proposed investment in Quebec for a battery cell manufacturing facility and a battery recycling operation. So not a bad track record as far as matchmaking goes. Of course, whether these investments were a direct result of the partnership, is perhaps questionable. But this type of partnership with this type of focus certainly helps. It facilitates these meetings. It supports them, and my hope is that it will also serve as a vehicle to leverage them to get further investment in that space. In terms of science, technology, and innovation, it's still relatively early days on this front, but with Canada joining the Horizon Europe, there's a lot of interest on that from both sides, and of course I could see a lot more taking place on that. And of course, it's going to be needed to help, support the big investments that I just named as well, because technologies are changing as we've heard today, and we need to think about how we're going to invest in the future as well. And thirdly, environmental, social, and governance criteria and standards. I understand there's a lot of work being done in this particular space in the international fora that Canada and the EU are members of, are both involved in. For example, the G7, the G20, Conference on Critical Materials and Metals, the International Energy Critical Minerals Working Party. So this is very important work. And, again, if we want to ensure a integration of supply chains, it's can't just be between Canada and the EU. We need to think more globally. And so this work is going to be even more important as we go forward. So, as a tool for de-risking, I'd say it's doing very well, but potentially could do even more, which we can get into a little bit later. Is this a model that can be replicated for other countries? Well, the Canada-EU relationship is a unique one, and it's going to be difficult to replicate it exactly as such. There's a long history of cooperation between Canada and the EU, particularly on the regulatory cooperation side. Both are members of the OECD and engage in similar international fora. And as I've said before, it's backed by a legally binding CETA, which helps it, again, backstop this kind of ambition. But, the EU is using this model in third countries. It has gone on to establish other similar partnerships in other countries, Argentina, Chile, the DRC, Greenland, Kazakhstan, Namibia, Norway, Rwanda, Ukraine, and Zambia. They're often a variation on similar themes, but again, the DNA in terms of what's inside these agreements is pretty much there. So it is being used. It's also been a model for Canada and EU member states as well. So Canada has been approached by other EU member states to engage in a similar type of partnership. We have, for example, the Canada-France dialogue on critical minerals, as well as the Canada-Germany energy partnership. So again, there are these other agreements even taking place on Canada and the member state level, but I think Canada does see the EU partnership as being the overarching mechanism. From my perspective, again, I look at the Canada-EU relationship more broadly. I think this is also a model for other areas of Canada-EU cooperation as well. Again, because CETA does provide that certainty, it's an example of what a cooperation in a particular sector can be achieved, and in terms of ambitions. And so I'd like to see it also exported within the broader Canada-EU relationship. So maybe I'll just stop that discussion now and take any questions that you have.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Mark. I shall join you in our little virtual platform that we have here. And we've heard a lot about some of the ambitions, perhaps, that the EU has at the moment, a lot of which is around the sourcing of those raw materials. Canada, of course, being a very big producing nation of all of this. I guess you've got that direction in terms of the flow of materials. From your perspective, do you think what is the EU expecting from this partnership? And to be provocative, are they expecting too much?
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, the EU, as I said, Canada does produce minerals, as you have said. But as I've said as well, if the idea is to increase that mineral supply, overnight, that's simply not going to happen. Not at least not in the short or medium term. But again, if the idea is to try to align interests and try to better integrate supply chain, I think it's certainly been successful, and I don't think it's asking too much from a Canadian perspective. It certainly aligns with Canada's raw materials strategy as well, particularly the work on standards in international fora. So I think at the end of the day, this is a good partnership. It's one that is working. We've already seen the list of examples in terms of the direct investments. I think that there's maybe there's a lot more that could be done there, for example. But I think there's other areas as well that can be improved. Again, focusing on the R&D side, I think there's a lot that can be done there. Again, tapping into the research and development that's being done in Canada and in the EU. These are two. Research and development is big for Canada. It's one of the Canada's strengths, is one of the EU strengths. So marrying them up in a strategic fashion makes a lot of sense. So.
I mean, just building on that. So you mentioned in passing there that Canada was now part of Horizon, and I know that a number of us that have either on the call or have spoken already today are part of some of the existing Horizon projects. Is there anything more you can tell us about that?
No, I can't really give you any more specifics. I know that we're definitely, everyone is very much anxious and looking forward to it, and getting all lined up on that. But I do expect some big announcements coming up in the later this year. One hopes. But again, there's a lot of interest and a lot of expectation on that Horizon piece as part of this broader strategic partnership as well. So hopefully I'll have more to share in the coming months.
Exciting. So
Yes.
with that, Mark, you mentioned that R&D was one of those areas in which the partnership can perhaps be strengthened or improved, and there's stuff that's coming through with regards to that. By the sounds of things, this agreement is one of it's a really good one. And it's got a huge amount of potential. Is there anything else or any other areas in which this partnership could be improved?
Sure. I think, again, nothing's ever perfect, but in this context, it is an example of where the EU and Canada are being more ambitious in terms of relationships, with something I'd like to see, something I like to support. But I do think there are other areas, the focus on direct investment is important, but maybe, not necessarily an end in it itself. There are other areas, for example, where Canada has a certain expertise and knowledge and history that can also be used, leveraged, shall we say, as part of that relationship. Under the Critical Raw Materials Act that the EU has passed, there's a lot of ambition in terms of building up domestic capacity in the critical raw material space, both mining, recycling, and processing as well. But there's going to be a big need within the EU and on the national and the member state level to build up their administration to help support this. And I think there are opportunities where Canada can help on that capacity building, for example, because there is this trust with this long relationship of cooperation. There is this trust, so there's a lot that can be done there that Canada can provide in terms of capacity building at the member state level. There is a big ambition for extraction in the EU itself, 10% on the CRMA. In order to meet that, there's going to need to be a lot more geological surveying and exploration. One could see an opportunity to try to encourage Canadian explorers to come into the EU and start looking at that as being a viable market for them as well. So that's another area where Canada is exceptional at, and more can be done for that. And I think the area of permitting could be another area where we could get into a bit more interest. The Critical Raw Materials Act provides a very interesting framework for trying to speed up the permitting process, streamline it for strategic projects. That's a model that maybe Canada can look at as well. So there's lessons to be learned on that side as well, because permitting is an issue not just in the European Union, but also in Canada as well, and other countries. So working together to help fix that or address those issues could certainly be looked at as well. And then I would just also say that, again, engagement in third countries would also be an area as well. So again, they're doing that in terms of international fora and what have you, but also maybe targeting at some of these other countries and working together to help try to address the needs, not just from a financing perspective, but from an ESG standards perspective, and also from a know-how perspective as well. So, and also access to the Canada and the EU market.
Right. So final question for you, Mark, and that just comes back to, do you have any final words on where an organization like CETA, like yourselves, actually fits into, I guess, that broader dialogue?
Sure. Well, again, we're sector agnostic, but in the case of critical raw materials or access to critical raw materials, that really goes to the heart of a lot of the issues that Canada and the EU and the wider world are addressing. So it's very much an area of focus for us. CUSHA doesn't have a direct role in this partnership. It's a government-to-government platform. But we can certainly help in terms of amplifying messages, as well as shedding light on some of the important work that's being done, as well as convening other interested stakeholders. I think that the issue of critical raw materials, as we've been hearing, it goes beyond the traditional sector segments, and actually one needs to start taking a broader a broader view of this. And so I think that having a cross-sectoral Canada-EU perspective can also be very interesting as well. We are relatively, the Canada-EU private sector is a relatively small but unique and increasingly important voice, and CUSHA is doing its part to try to aggregate these voices. So.
Awesome. Brilliant. Well, thank you
Great.
very, very much, Mark. Good luck with everything
Thank
that
you.
is to come. And thank you for joining us today. Round
Thank
of
you.
applause. Brilliant. Okay, so we're on to our last presentation this is going to be given by a fantastic individual who I have the absolute pleasure of working with on one of those Horizon projects that Mark has just mentioned. Gert-Jan, if you have any slides to share, now is a really good time to be hitting those buttons, and we'll welcome you to the stage. So Gert-Jan is, as you can see from her slides, at University College Dublin, and Gert-Jan is going to be sharing with us some of her thoughts on mining ethics and trust. Gert-Jan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So, as Sarah said, I'm working with her on this EU project. And just to make sure that the audience is clear, I'm a psychologist. I know very little about mining. I know what I know is mainly from Sarah. And just to introduce the topic of my talk, I'd like to start off with some data, because what I'm really interested in is the reputation of the sector of mining. And if you look at data and you compare the mining sector with a whole range of different sectors, you can see that mining is not doing so well. In fact, mining is down when you look at how consumers rate it in terms of social responsibility, is down there with tobacco industry, with the alcohol industry, and it's even doing worse than the oil and petroleum industry. So I like the topic of this conference, critical choices, because I think as a sector, the mining sector has to think about why are they doing so poorly when it comes down to their reputation on social responsibility. And make no mistake, I looked at the data from 2013, 10 years before this data was released. It was exactly at the same level. Nothing has changed. So the reason I want to give this talk, the reason I'm here, is because I'm interested to think about why is mining down that list so low, and how might we think differently as a sector on these reasons. So one of these reasons, and Jeff already mentioned this, he called it the difference between inside and outside, can actually be found in the IRMM report 2020, who had a list of key findings where they compared sectors on different dimensions. And one of their the first key finding is that there's a significant gap between what the sector is doing and what society expects from them. And that's exactly where I think we have to start thinking as a sector on where might we improve and how can this be fixed. So this gap between society expectations and the performances in the sector. If you think about these discrepancies, then I think we have to think about mining not from a responsible point of view, but we actually have to start thinking as mining from an ethical perspective. And an ethical perspective is different from responsibility because it focuses on actually what is seen as the right or wrong thing to do. So this is something, and this was actually also in one of the flyers of the conference. This is in the eye of the beholder. This is not something that the sector can define for themselves. This is not something that is said in laws or governance or regulations. What is right or wrong, what is ethical, is actually in everyone's mind. So if you look at sort of the definitions, business ethics, so from a business perspective, ethics usually refer to standards for morally right or wrong conduct. But that's taking the view of a sector, a business. If you look at a consumer's point of view, if you look at the general public, then you might think about the perceived business ethics. So how does a consumer, how does someone of the general public think about these business practices, and to what extent do they believe this is morally acceptable? To what extent do they think this is actually the right thing to do or not? And this is exactly where Jeff was talking about the inside versus the outside. There is a huge discrepancy between what the business is thinking is ethical and what they're doing, and how this is actually perceived by anyone else outside of the sector. And this is where Benjamin Sovacool has labeled this as an ethical conundrum. So he is, and this is a quote from a paper from 2020, he is saying, okay, the mineral and metal supplies are geologically determined, but socially mediated. So this discrepancy is key to start thinking about the reputation of the sector. Now back to this fantastic project that Sarah and I work on. It's called Vector. I just thought I'd throw it in here. Have a look at our website if you're interested. We're trying to look at the different social and geological challenges to access critical raw materials in Europe. And I'm particularly involved in this part of the project where we look at the societal challenges around this, and I'm very willing to share some data, fresh data that we found on these ethical components. So as part of this Vector project, we are actually looking at an argument that's often given in the mining sector, that we actually do very important work because we help to supply the green transition. There's a huge increase of demand of critical raw materials, and we're supplying that. So we are essential sector. We are really important. And that's all true. But the question is, from the perspective of a consumer and the general public, does that mean that there's actually a more morally acceptable business case going on? And so we did a survey. I'm based in Ireland, as Sarah said, and we did a survey. It was ran under 80, It was run under 81 people, representative sample from Ireland. It was a pilot study, but actually it already revealed some very interesting data. So we asked people, we explained to them that in the green transition, we do need more raw materials. And we asked them for 5 different sectors, whether they thought these sectors, when thinking about their role in the decarbonization of Europe, how ethical and unethical they were. And again, as confirmed before, the mining sector was rated as the lowest ethical sector across this range of sectors. So then the question is, why is this? Why is the mining sector so far down below all other sectors? And one way we started thinking is to think about what is the level of trust in the mining sector. And if you think about trust from in the literature, trust refers to the extent to which people are willing to rely on someone else or on some other industry. So to what extent are you willing to rely on the mining sector is really the question here. And we believe that this might influence the level of the ethical perceptions of the mining sector. Now, the willingness to which we're willing to rely on the mining sector is not just a generic sense of trust, but trust depends on different dimensions. So you can talk about the competence of a sector, which is the extent to which an organization is capable, effective, skillful. So to what extent do we trust a sector is competent in doing what they're doing? There is trust in the dimension of integrity. To what extent is an organization showing integrity? Are they sincere? Do they tell the truth? Do they fulfill promises? And there's a dimension of trust called benevolence. And benevolence refers to what extent is an organization caring about the welfare of others? To what extent do they act in the interest of society? And the best way to think about this is when you think about, is there a secret or hidden agenda from that company? And if that's the case, then usually benevolence is felt to be quite low. So what we were interested to see is, do these different dimensions of trust influence the extent to which the ordinary public believes that the mining sector is ethical or not? So as part of that survey study, we measured these different dimensions of trust, and we regressed that on the perceived ethics of the mining sector. So first of all, what we saw was that integrity was the highest predictor of the perceived ethics of the mining sector. We also see that the more benevolent or the less benevolent the organization was, the less ethical the mining sector was seen. But finally, and I think very interestingly, competence, the trusting competence, did not predict how ethical the mining sector was seen. Now, this is where I think there's a key message to be found, because a lot of messaging, a lot of communication, a lot of PR is actually focusing on competence. We are good at our jobs. We do, we do comply with guidelines. We're skillful, we're effective, we're professional. But that is not the key reason why the sector isn't seen as ethical. It is much more to do with integrity. It's much more to do with benevolence. So to finish this one off, I really like the topic of this conference, critical choices, because I think as a sector and as a sector as a whole, is really important to start making critical choices. And critical choices to focus on, okay, how can we increase trust in order to be seen as a more ethical sector, and get away from the area of tobacco and alcohol and oil and gas companies. And I think when you think about these things, is we just heard Louis talking bribery and corruption. This is directly linked to integrity. We've got to work on that. We've got to think about this PR issue and this reputation issue. And in my mind, it's much more about being convinced by the general public where we're doing things wrong, instead of trying to convince the public that we're doing responsible work, because there's a real tension between them. I'll finish there. Thank you very much. There is my email address if you want to see it. I'll hand over back to you, Sarah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Geertje. Round of applause, everybody, for the amazing Geertje, and just a fantastic talk that you've just given there. If our other wonderful speakers from today want to turn on their cameras, and because I know that there are a number of questions, been all kinds of messages whizzing around behind the scenes following your talk there, Geertje. Maybe Jeff, if I can bring you into the conversation. So Geertje was there talking about those, I guess, the perspectives of different people, and likening them to what you were saying earlier about being inside or being outside. Was that a correct interpretation of what you were saying earlier, or are we stretching it so that Geertje can make it fit her talk? What do you think, Jeff?
No, it is the interpretation aligns, and it's interesting around perspective is that, the outside world doesn't see all the different functions and different teams and all the different activities that go on within a business. They just see the net impact. So that level of competence that we value inside an organization often isn't seen outside. It's just basically, well, did the company do what they said they were going to do or not? And part of a challenge that goes with that as well is, it's a topic for today, is around perspective, is that companies, and not aligned specifically to mining companies, decide what they're going to do because that's based on the resource, and then announce it to everybody, and then they have to defend their position because it hasn't been contextualized. It's not fit for purpose. It didn't align with what the exploration team said 10 years ago when they came out and did the projects. And that's one of the innate challenges of resource extraction, is that it takes decades to do, but we have such high turnover and change in teams that, internally there's a lot of change, but externally the outside view is it's just a big monolith coming down the hill. And if people have got long memories, unfortunately. So that trust, and there's plenty of literature around, people will trust a process, and they will trust, the transparency of that. If you follow that process, they seldom trust individuals or their competence, which is interesting.
Ferchie, do you want to respond to that? I see you nodding.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, I agree. I thought something I picked up earlier in one of the presentations is I think there's a strong tendency to want to explain and want to convince people that we're doing the right thing. But if you think about yourself, it's very difficult to be convinced by someone who's telling you what to think and trying to convince you. So I would very much like to reverse it. And I think the sector might want to start listening to what is said, and maybe take all that opposition that is faced as an opportunity to think differently about yourselves. And it may not always be what you like to hear, but it could be a way to change your thinking. And I think that is really critical.
Yeah, and I think that the graph that you showed fairly early on from the GlobeScan review. So I was in the room, I think, when many mining companies saw that for the first time. And it was very interesting because the initial reaction was, oh, well, they asked the wrong questions. Because no one wants to be told that they're rubbish or not trusted. I think just to that, Ferchie, there's a great question that's come in the chat from Maeve, and who asks, I wonder whether people in the sector thinking mining companies are benevolent and full of integrity, do we even trust ourselves? What do you think?
I think it's an excellent question. I'd love to do some research on that. I don't have the answer to it, but I think it's a good question, and maybe somebody else wants to reflect on it.
Well, I don't know, maybe let's go across to Victor. Do you think that the mining sector as a whole trusts itself? What do you think?
That's a bold question, Sarah. I believe it depends. I mean, clearly there are companies that take opportunistic approaches, and sometimes the same company in different jurisdictions might behave in a different way. We have seen that, for instance, in South America, where European and Canadian companies were not really following the same standards that they have at their that they have at home. But it's also true that it depends basically on the leadership of the company. And we are seeing now that some companies, they really try to uphold to, let's say, ethical behaviors. But others, I mean, this is a sector like any others where you can see that some, if there is some stain coming from one particular company, it will affect the entire sector. And it's not only a question of the size of the company. I believe it's mainly a question of the leadership of the company. Where you have responsible people taking the lead, then things might be, it's always a difficult industry, but things might go in the right direction. In other cases, you have people that behave like criminals, and that also exists in mining. No question about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Victor. Mark, yes, do you want to come in on that?
Sure. Well, I'd like to just follow up on what Victor said, because I do agree. But I think this is where standards, for example, processes and transparency really play a key role. So it's not about whether companies can trust themselves, it's whether or not they have the right processes in place. That the question doesn't even have to be asked. It's just simply people do what they're supposed to be done, and it's all done in a transparent manner. And I think that's what helps build trust within an organization and also within the communities at large.
Thank you, Mark. Keeping maybe Mark, you on the hook here. There's a question that's come in the Q&A that asks, and it's also to Hershey as well, but maybe Mark, you've got an opinion on it too. So what specific strategies are employed by the European Union to emphasize its role as an advocate for responsible mining globally compared to potentially its efforts within EU borders? Do you have any thoughts on that? And then I'll go to Hershey, and I'm sure Victor will also have some thoughts on that as well.
So the question, I'm sorry, it broke up a little bit, is whether or not the EU, what does the EU, sorry, if you could just repeat that.
Yeah, so the question is, what specific strategies are employed by the EU to emphasize its role as an advocate for responsible mining globally, perhaps compared to what goes on within the EU borders? So there's a bit of emotiveness in there.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, at the end of the day, mining remains a member state competence within the EU. So there is only so much that the EU can do in terms of amending mining codes as such. There's, of course, competence that they have on environmental standards, which they put in, but ultimately it's the member states to enforce. So again, I think what we're seeing with the Critical Raw Materials Act is an effort to try to move the needle a little bit on that and create some kind of an ambition that can be followed within a framework. Internationally, I think the EU has a little bit more room to maneuver in terms of its negotiations within international fora, again on these standards, and as well as the partnerships it has with third countries in terms of the investments that it makes through its partnership agreements and what have you. So I think that internationally the EU has a bit more freedom of scope in terms of achieving its objectives as it does internally, which is a bit ironic, but I think that's the nature of it. So,
thank you, Mark. Victor, do you have any thoughts? I see you're smiling, and then we'll go to Hershey.
Well, I might have a slightly different view on basically for two reasons. The first, European Union is a group of countries, and some countries are just competing against each others. So it's difficult to have this vision inside the European Union. And the second factor is that you have a lot of well-intentioned people there. And Guillaume was talking about the EU conflict minerals regulation that was approved back in 2017. And I remember because I was visiting the DRC after the approval of the regulation. And what happened is basically the regulation banned the DRC as a source of raw materials to the European Union. So imports from the DRC will be banned in 2021. But in 2017, because of the regulation, European buyers left the country. And because of the Dodd-Frank Act, the Americans also left the countries before that. So the only ones who remained were the Chinese. And when I was talking with the artisanal miners, they were telling me that they were receiving far less money than they did before, because the only buyers available were the Chinese, and now this balance between supply and demand was affected. So some policy making made in Brussels has not really the impact that policymakers were hoping for. And this is quite common in the European policy. For instance, the Critical Raw Materials Act. A lot of, in my opinion, again, good intentions there, but I don't see that countries and communities will be relying on giving away the land use management power that they have. So we'll be seeing many cases ending up in court. But again, this is my perspective. Not so optimistic.
All perspectives are welcome here. That if there's one rule for this particular conference as a whole, it's all perspectives are welcome. So awesome. Thank you. Hershey, any thoughts from yourself? And then I'm going to finish off by asking you Dave's question from the chat.
All right, so thanks. Now, just to follow on what Victor is saying, because I really agree there, is that I think there's a risk that the EU might use that argument, we need to mine in Europe, because otherwise we're going to get it in China, or we're going to get it in Africa, or we're going to get it in Latin America. And so that's a message from a fear-based perspective. There's a risk if you don't follow our rules of regulation, we don't mine here, then the situation outside might be far worse. And if from a trust perspective, that's not really a way to convince people to actually trust the sector, because they might feel forced into accepting mining within Europe. So I would argue it's really important the EU and the sector really think through the way the operation, the business practices within Europe, without that fear message attached to it.
Thanks, Gert-Jan. So final question for yourself before I pass over to the lovely Ludovine to do a very quick wrap up of what we've heard this morning. Gert-Jan, from Dave in the chat, Dave asks, if we said to the public, okay, we hear you, you don't trust mining companies, but here you go, here's a budget, here's where you find the expertise, oversee it yourselves, would that change the perspective or not? Will they still say no? What do you think?
My gut feeling is they will say no, because, you know, it's also a very easy solution to say, I hold my hands up in the air, I don't have the answer, here you go, do it yourself. Usually, in whatever family situation that same argument is used, it doesn't really work to convince someone that you are doing the right thing. So my gut feeling is that I don't think that will work.
What do you think, Mark? Do you agree with Gert-Jan's answer?
Well, yes, in general, I would say yes. Yes, I do. So,
Victor, what do you reckon?
Yes, I fully agree with that. I mean, these discussions are very emotional, and people don't change their opinions. Basically, we have seen this coming in politics. It looks as a sort of football fans. So people basically they stay on their field, and they are not sometimes not even available to listen to. And once you are trying to, they understand that you are trying to educate them, there's a backlash there, and people say, no way, I'll stop listening. And that's the end.
Yeah, go on, Gert-Jan.
Just a final word here. So I also think that, and this is where the Vector project is a really good example, I think the sector needs to get experts on communication, reputation, organizational structures in-house, instead of, and no offense to anyone in the room, having geologists or non-experts in communication do that work. So I'm going to have a plea, invite more social scientists, let them actually think about these questions instead of, let's say, people are not trained in that area.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gert-Jan. And I think final words from myself before I pass over to Ludovine to summarize what we've heard this morning is actually harking back to some of the first session that we had yesterday, which was where, yeah, there are areas where you think, well, it's either it's not my job to get in and fix it, or, okay, maybe I'm the wrong person because nobody likes me. Actually, we saw some examples of rolling up our sleeves and saying, you know what, I can contribute and improve things in various ways. So where can I come to the table in a way that does help this improvement, but also as well, the business model of mining. I think we all know that it needs to either change or be improved in fairly dramatic senses if we're going to be able to inch our way forward to people actually trusting one another a little bit more with this. But we're hearing lots about that, not just yesterday and today, but for the rest of the week as well. Lots of ideas as to how we can do this and how we can go into that optimistic world rather than everything is doom and gloom, because we want the world to become a better place. Ludovine, would you like to very quickly summarize what we've heard this morning?
Crikey. To be honest, I think the one that will stay with me is, do we trust ourselves? Because I would argue that a lot of our models demonstrate that we don't. And an element of that is the fact that exploration has been removed from producers and hived off into specialist companies that are all about that exploration risk. By doing that, we have created more need to create a language of trust for investors. And that's what CRISCO is. CRISCO is a language of trust from hyper risk of exploration to the people who put their money on that gamble. And I'm just very aware that as we've created that language of trust, we've also probably made it more insular from the rest of the world. We heard a lot this morning about how to be more or less sure of what's under the ground and what it's worth and what we can do with it. The fact is, when we honestly tell people, look, we don't always know what's under the ground, even though we've done a lot of work there. Sometimes their first reaction is to say, okay, well, that means you're not entitled to do anything more. So when we say that trust is in the eye of the beholder, the language that we're going to build around what we're doing is also a big part of that. And that language reflects our models. So I hear what you're saying on the business model of mining. I would say maybe let's even hone in on the business model of exploration. Maybe there's a reason why keeping exploration inside producers worked for a while. There's a reason why we removed them from producers, because it's high risk and, let's be honest, less profitable. But maybe we're paying the cost of those choices today. And so maybe new models, or maybe accepting the fact that the ones we've had in place for 30 years have led us here.
Thank you very much for that, Ludovine. So some challenges and some thoughts that take us through into session 3. Remember, we have 8 sessions, by the way, everybody. So if you've enjoyed any of what you've heard today, but also more importantly, if you have disagreed with anything that you've heard today, please come and engage with us, because we know we've only managed to make space for some voices, some perceptions. We want to hear from as many of you as possible. So this afternoon, we're going to be joined by a fantastic array of wonderful individuals who are going to come from all kinds of backgrounds, including civil society, through to Ellie Shaw from ERM is going to tell us all about the mine we all want to see. I'm looking forward to seeing this particular picture. What is it going to look like? Fantastic. We've got Mark Robinson from EITI, so talking about that tax transparency, some more of those governance levers that we've got here as well, together with a host of other fantastic speakers. If this afternoon is a horrible time period or time zone for yourselves, don't worry, because we're back again tomorrow morning at the same time that we've been talking about today. So at 8 o'clock UK time tomorrow morning, we've got some fabulous individuals joining us again from Australia, sharing some new tools and techniques that we might be able to consider when we're thinking about everything from exploration through to the raw materials and the full supply chain. We've also got the fantastic Bursting the Bubble panel. Now, this has become a stock item in our Responsible Raw Material conferences, because despite the fact that we try and bring together as many different perspectives as possible, we're always kind of missing those questions that come from your normal person who lives in society. Because newsflash, most of the 8 billion people on our planet don't really care where the raw materials come from. Shock horror. But this is a case here of we need to understand what are the perceptions of someone who doesn't know anything necessarily about raw materials or mining, but does care about the world in which they live. So Bursting the Bubble panel is where we have 4 fantastically brave and courageous individuals come along and have that discussion about mining, about raw materials, and just say what comes into their minds, because we need to be able to hear it, be us working within governments or within mining companies or with investments or in civil society organizations. What is the word from that person on the street? What do they actually care about? So that is taking place tomorrow morning as well. Finally, a massive thank you to our fabulous speakers that we've had join us for today's first session. So to Anita, Guillaume, Jeff, Mark, Victor, Louis, Mark, and Hershey, a massive, massive thank you. You've given us a huge amount to think about, and also a huge amount of inspiration. How do we get everybody to trust us? And also as well, when we're making those critical choices, how do we make sure we take into account as many different perspectives as possible? So with that, thank you very much, everybody, and see you later on today at 3